Hey guys, today we begin with a gentle journey through 50 mythical creatures that turned out to be surprisingly real. We'll meet giant squids that inspired the kraken, one-horned rhinos mistaken for unicorns, and glowing birds that sparked the legend of the phoenix. Each tale shows how simple sightings grew into the stories that still amaze us today. But before you get comfortable, please make sure to like the video and subscribe if you genuinely appreciate the work I do here. And please let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, put your phone or television remote out of reach, and let's move into tonight's journey together. In the dim scriptoriums of medieval monasteries, where candlelight danced across illuminated manuscripts, scribes would pause before drawing a particular creature. Their hands would tremble slightly as they sketched the basilisk, the king of serpents, whose very gaze could turn a living soul to stone. These weren't mere fairy tales scribbled by imaginative monks. The basilisk appeared in the most serious of scholarly works, the bestiaries that served as natural history texts for centuries. Learned men wrote with absolute certainty about this serpent that could kill with a single glance, its breath so toxic that it could split rocks and wither entire gardens. The terror was real, even if the creature wasn't quite what they imagined. Buried beneath layers of medieval embellishment lay fragments of actual encounters with real serpents that had genuinely terrified ancient peoples. In the temples of Egypt, priests had long worshipped cobras, recognizing their deadly power and incorporating them into religious ceremonies. The uraeus, the cobra symbol adorning pharaonic crowns, wasn't mere decoration but a representation of divine protection and lethal authority. When Greek traders and soldiers ventured into Egypt and Africa, they returned with spine-chilling accounts of serpents that could spit venom across considerable distances, temporarily blinding their victims. To eyes unschooled in natural history, this toxic spray might easily be interpreted as a death-dealing gaze. The venom of certain African cobras could indeed cause excruciating pain and temporary blindness when it contacted human eyes, effects that, to ancient observers, seemed like the supernatural powers of sight itself. The very name basilisk reveals how these stories transform through centuries of retelling. Derived from the Greek basiliskos, meaning little king, the term originally described a smaller creature, perhaps the horned viper found across Mediterranean regions. But as merchants and travelers carried tales from port to port, the basilisk grew in both size and supernatural ability. What began as cautionary warnings about venomous snakes evolved into legends of dragon-like monsters ruling over desolate wastelands, their domains marked by scattered bones and withered vegetation. Eventually, the myth met reality in the most mundane of settings. In crumbling castle courtyards, where naturalists of the Renaissance kept collections of exotic animals, live cobras were housed in stone enclosures. Visitors could observe these serpents safely, noting their defensive postures and the way they reared when threatened. The deadly gaze became simply an animal protecting itself. The king of serpents was revealed as a creature of flesh and blood, remarkable enough in its own right, but bound by the same natural laws as any other living thing. And in those quiet moments of observation, another myth gently dissolved into the realm of natural history. You're drifting through ancient chronicles, where scribes with tired eyes recorded the impossible. A creature so pure it could only be glimpsed through morning mist, its single horn catching light like crystallized dreams. The unicorn wasn't just fantasy, it was memory, distorted by distance and desire, of something wonderfully real. Persian merchants spoke in hushed tones around dying campfires, describing a white beast that appeared near mountain streams. Greek historians, ever curious, documented similar sightings from travelers returning from distant lands. Medieval monks, copying manuscripts by candlelight, added their own careful observations. Each account shared curious details: the spiral horn, the healing properties, the way it vanished like smoke when approached too eagerly. But here's where legend meets reality, where your sleepy mind can rest on solid ground. Those Silk Road caravans carried more than just stories, they brought proof. Indian rhinoceroses, magnificent and solitary, grazed in distant valleys where few Europeans had ventured. Glimpsed through heat haze or early morning fog, a rhino's single horn could easily transform in a tired traveler's tale. Add the mystical narwhal tusks, those spiraled wonders from Arctic waters, sold in European markets as alicorn's unicorn horns with magical properties. Court apothecaries, working by flickering oil lamps, would carefully scrape these precious tusks into powder. They'd mix the shavings into warm milk, creating lullaby potions for restless nobles. These sleepy draughts promised not just rest, but purification of the soul. The unicorn's horn, they believed, could neutralize any poison, cure any ailment, bring peace to the most troubled mind. As you let this story settle into your drowsy thoughts, imagine the truth behind the myth. Somewhere on a moonlit steppe, a rhinoceros moves slowly through tall reeds. Water ripples gently around its feet. Its horn, that single magnificent horn, catches starlight as it grazes peacefully. No magic needed, just the quiet wonder of a creature that inspired countless dreams. The mist rises softly from the water, and perhaps, just perhaps, you understand why our ancestors saw unicorns in the shadows. Picture Odysseus, trembling in that echoing cave, as Polyphemus the Cyclops devours his companions one by one. Homer's ancient words painted this monster with chilling precision, a giant whose single eye gleamed like a burning coal in the center of his forehead. The Cyclops hurled boulders that crashed into the sea like thunder, shaking the very foundations of the world. This wasn't just storytelling. This was a warning whispered from sailor to sailor across the wine, dark Mediterranean. Generations of seafarers gathered around flickering fires on moonless nights, sharing tales that made even the bravest among them glance nervously toward shadowed cliffs. They spoke of islands where these one-eyed titans still roamed, places where ships disappeared without a trace and only splintered wood washed ashore. The stories grew with each telling, fed by genuine fear and the human need to explain the unexplainable. But here's where the mist of legend begins to clear, revealing something far more beautiful than any myth. Along those same Mediterranean beaches where ancient sailors told their tales, massive skulls occasionally emerged from eroding cliffsides. These belonged to dwarf elephant screechers that had evolved in isolation on islands like Cyprus, Malta, and Sicily. When their flesh had long since returned to Earth, their bones told a different story entirely. The elephant skull holds a secret that fooled even learned men for centuries. Where we might expect to see two eye sockets, there's something far more dramatic: a single, gaping nasal cavity positioned directly in the center of the forehead. To someone unfamiliar with elephant anatomy, this looked exactly like the eye socket of an enormous, one-eyed giant. The actual eye sockets, smaller and positioned on the sides, were often overlooked or dismissed. Early fossil hunters, armed with more enthusiasm than scientific method, confidently declared these discoveries proof of an ancient race of giants. They measured the skulls against human proportions and gasped at the implications. Museum collections filled with bones labeled as Cyclops remains or ancient giant humans, while scholars penned learned treatises about prehistoric civilizations of one-eyed monsters. Tonight, imagine yourself in a hidden grotto where turquoise waters lap gently against worn stone. Ancient bones rest in tidal pools, polished smooth by countless waves until they gleam like ivory treasures. The Mediterranean keeps its secrets well, but sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind drops to a whisper, you might glimpse the truth behind our most enduring monsters. In the grey twilight between sea and sky, where Norse longships carved their paths through waters that seemed to breathe, sailors whispered of something that defied the natural order. They spoke of islands that weren't islands at all, but living things that rose from the depths like nightmares given flesh. The Kraken, they called it, though the name felt inadequate for something so vast it could be mistaken for land itself. Picture this. A crew spots what appears to be a small island, perhaps a good place to anchor and fish. The water around it teems with life, practically boiling with fish, eager to escape something lurking below. The sailors lower their nets, and that's when the island begins to sink, slowly at first, then with alarming speed, as massive tentacles thicker than ancient oaks break the surface. The ship tilts, groans, and disappears beneath waves that close over it like a closing fist. These weren't just campfire stories. By the 1800s, evidence was literally washing up on shores. Icelandic beaches became impromptu museums of the impossible when colossal squid carcasses stranded themselves on the volcanic sands. 10 meters long, with eyes the size of dinner plates and tentacles that could have wrapped around a cathedral spire. Local fishermen stood dwarfed beside these titans, finally understanding that the old stories hadn't been exaggerations at all. But here's where it gets interesting. The sea has a way of making the extraordinary seem supernatural. Imagine a giant squid, already magnificent and alien, rising through waters alive with bioluminescent plankton. Every movement creates cascades of ghostly blue-green light, turning the creature into something that seems to glow from within. Add storm swells that magnify everything, waves that turn tentacles into mountain ridges, and suddenly you have a monster worthy of legend. The truth, as it often does, finds a middle ground between skepticism and myth. Far below us right now, in the crushing darkness of the abyssal plains, giant squid drift like living submarines. They hunt in silence, their alien intelligence navigating a world we've barely glimpsed. They're not the ship-destroying islands of Norse imagination, but they're no less remarkable for being real. Sometimes the truth is strange enough that we don't need to embellish it. Picture yourself drifting through time, where the boundary between sea and dream grows wonderfully blurred. In ancient Assyria, scribes recorded tales of Oannes, a fish-tailed being who emerged from the Persian Gulf to teach humanity the arts of civilization. These weren't monsters lurking in dark depths, but gentle teachers whose very presence brought wisdom and wonder. The cuneiform tablets speak of creatures who sang not to destroy, but to guide lost souls towards shore, their voices carrying the rhythm of tides and the whisper of ancient knowledge. The Greeks expanded these dreams into something more complex, more beautiful. Their sirens weren't the horrid bird women of later myth, but graceful beings whose lower bodies curved like dolphins beneath moonlit waves. Odysseus heard their song not a call to destruction, but an irresistible invitation to understand mysteries that mortal minds could barely grasp. Greek sailors described glimpses of silver tails disappearing beneath their ships, and poets wrote of sea nymphs who combed their hair with coral combs while sitting on rocks that jutted from the wine-dark sea like forgotten thrones. When European explorers began crossing vast oceans, their ship logs filled with similar encounters. Columbus himself noted strange figures in Caribbean waters. British naval officers sketched creatures they swore possessed human torsos and fishtails, creatures who watched their vessels with curious, intelligent eyes. These weren't hallucinations born of fear. The sailors described them with wonder, not terror. In their journals, mermaids appeared at dawn and dusk, when light played tricks with distance and the sea held secrets in its gentle swells. Modern science offers gentler explanations. Dugongs and manatees, those peaceful marine mammals, surface to breathe in ways that create remarkably human silhouettes. Through a spyglass distorted by heat shimmer and salt spray, a manatee's rounded head emerging from blue-green water could easily transform into a maiden's face. Their grey skin, warmed by tropical sun, might catch light like pale human flesh, while their paddle-like tails remain hidden beneath the surface. Dehydration blurred vision. Loneliness made patterns where none existed. Sometimes rum turned distant seaweed into flowing hair. The human mind, isolated for months on endless waters, naturally sought familiar forms in an alien environment. But perhaps the truth matters less than the wonder. Imagine now a quiet Caribbean inlet, where ancient coral forms underwater gardens. A manatee surfaces slowly, unhurried, her broad back breaking the mirror-smooth water. She exhales not a song, but something softer. A gentle sigh that carries across the lagoon like a lullaby, reminding us that some magic needs no explanation at all. You're a medieval peasant in Bavaria, and you've just unearthed what looks like the skull of a house-sized lizard. Congratulations, you've either discovered proof that dragons were real, or you're about to become the village's most creative storyteller. Spoiler alert, it's probably both. Long before paleontology was a twinkle in anyone's eye, ancient civilizations were stumbling across fossilized remains that demanded explanation. In China, the long Mythos serpentine, wise dragons of legend weren't just flights of fancy. They were attempts to make sense of the massive vertebrae and skulls washing out of riverbanks after floods. When you find a jawbone the size of a small boat, giant, magical serpent seems like a perfectly reasonable explanation. Meanwhile, in medieval Europe, wyverns dominated heraldry and folklore. Two-legged, wings like bat membranes, breath that could melt armor sound familiar. That's because European dragons were likely inspired by pterosaur fossils eroding from chalk cliffs. Imagine finding a 20-foot wingspan skeleton jutting from a hillside. Medieval monks didn't have David Attenborough documentaries to explain that away. The Americas had their own version of this fossil-to-myth pipeline. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent of Mesoamerica, combined reptilian features with avian characteristics in ways that seem almost paleontologically informed. Recent discoveries suggest that some dinosaur species in what's now Mexico actually had proto-feathers. Ancient peoples might have been assembling these clues long before we started putting them in museums. But here's where it gets really interesting. The Gobi Desert and alpine regions have been naturally exposing dinosaur bones for millennia. Wind and erosion work like the world's slowest archaeologists, gradually revealing sauropod vertebrae and theropod skulls. Nomadic peoples crossing these landscapes would have encountered these remains regularly, weaving them into oral traditions that eventually became the dragon myths we know today. Then came 1910, when Western explorers encountered the Komodo dragon for the first time. Suddenly, the idea of giant reptilian predators wasn't so mythical anymore. These 10-foot monitors, with their venomous bites and surprising speed, proved that nature could indeed produce real-life dragons. They just didn't breathe fire. Disappointing, yes, but still pretty impressive for something that actually exists. As twilight settles over a forgotten corner of the Gobi, evening winds scatter sand away from something white and ancient. Another vertebra emerges, smooth and massive, waiting to inspire the next generation of dragon stories. Because sometimes, the most incredible myths are just fossils with really good marketing. In the lamplit chambers where Sinbad spun his tales, merchants leaned closer when he spoke of the roc. Not just any bird, mind you, but a creature so vast its shadow could eclipse entire valleys. Picture wings that stretched like thunderclouds, talons that could carry off elephants like field mice, and eggs the size of palace domes. The sailors who survived these encounters described a darkness that fell without warning, as if the sun itself had been plucked from the sky by something impossibly large and impossibly hungry. But here's where legend meets bone and fossil. In the highlands of Madagascar, buried beneath centuries of red earth, scientists have unearthed the remains of Aepyornis maximus, the elephant bird. Standing 3 meters tall, weighing half a ton, these flightless giants ruled their island kingdom until humans arrived with fire and ambition. Their eggs, genuine marvels of nature, held 10 liters of yolk and white. Imagine cracking one for breakfast and feeding a village for a week. These weren't mythical rock eggs, but they were certainly large enough to inspire wonder in any medieval traveler lucky enough to stumble across a shell. Across the ocean, in the mist-shrouded mountains of New Zealand, the Ori carried memories of Puakai great eagles that could snatch grown warriors from cliff-tops. The Haast's eagle wasn't quite rock-sized, but with a 3-meter wingspan and talons like meat hooks, it was the largest eagle that ever lived. It hunted moa, those towering flightless birds, swooping from mountain peaks like feathered death. When Polynesian settlers arrived, both predator and prey vanished within centuries, leaving only stories that would later echo strangely with tales from Arabian Nights. Meanwhile, in the bustling markets of medieval Cairo, merchants displayed curiosities that made pilgrims gasp and reach for their purses. Ostrich eggs, elephant bird fragments, even the occasional whale riball presented as remnants of legendary creatures. Genuine rock eggshell, vendors would declare with straight faces, watching wide-eyed buyers imagine the mighty bird that laid such treasures. Commerce and wonder made profitable bedfellows in those sandy marketplaces where anything was possible for the right price. Now drift with me across a starlit steppe where the wind carries whispers of vanished wings. Somewhere beneath these endless grasses lies a fragment of shell, curved and ancient, catching moonlight like a forgotten promise. The rock may live only in stories now, but its shadow still falls across our dreams, reminding us that once, not so very long ago, the sky belonged to giants. In the depths of Algonquin winter, when snow blankets the northern forests in silence so complete it rings in your ears. Certain words were never spoken aloud. The elders knew that desperate times called forth desperate hungers, and among their people there existed taboos older than memory itself. To consume human flesh was not merely forbidden, it was a doorway to something far worse than death. It was an invitation to the Wendigo. Picture a creature born from the marriage of starvation and despair. The Wendigo stalks through Algonquin legend as something that was once human, transformed by the breaking of the most sacred taboo. Those who tasted human flesh in their darkest hour did not simply commit an act of survival, they opened their hearts to an eternal winter. Their hearts turned to ice, literally freezing within their chests, while their bodies stretched and contorted into something gaunt and terrible. Towering 15 feet tall, with yellowed fangs and eyes like dying embers, the Wendigo became a walking reminder of what lay waiting for those who crossed certain lines. But here's where legend meets unsettling reality. Wendigo psychosis was a documented phenomenon among indigenous communities, recorded by early psychiatrists and anthropologists. During harsh winters when food became scarce, some individuals would develop an intense craving for human flesh, accompanied by paranoia and violent behavior. They would claim to be transforming into Wendigos themselves, describing the sensation of their hearts freezing and their bodies changing. These cases weren't mere folklore, they were psychological responses to extreme famine conditions, cultural trauma, and the terrifying possibility of crossing humanity's final boundary. The imagery of the Wendigo didn't emerge from nowhere. In these same northern forests, grey wolf packs would strip moose carcasses down to bone, leaving skeletal remains scattered across the snow. These bleached bones, jutting from white drifts like gnarled fingers, shaped how people imagined the creature all angles and hunger, nothing soft left. Step outside on a winter night in the deep woods. Feel how the snow muffles every sound until all you hear is the wind sighing through fir needles, each gust like a distant breath moving through the darkness. In that silence, the Wendigo waits. Puerto Rico in the mid-1990s, where the humid night air carries whispers of something stalking through the darkness. Farmers wake to find their goats drained of blood, puncture wounds marking their necks, yet no sign of struggle. The creature responsible? El Chupacabra, a goat sucker, described as a reptilian beast with spines running down its back, glowing red eyes, and an insatiable thirst for blood. These reports spread like wildfire across Latin America and into the southern United States. Eyewitness accounts painted a terrifying picture, a creature somewhere between a hairless dog and an alien, moving with unnatural speed through farmyards under cover of darkness. Livestock found mysteriously drained became front-page news, and the legend of the Chupacabra was born, capturing imaginations and spawning countless investigations. But reality, as often happens, proved far more mundane than myth. Wildlife biologists began capturing and examining the alleged chupacabras, only to discover they were coyotes suffering from severe cases of sarcoptic mange. This parasitic skin condition causes fur to fall out in patches, leaving behind raw, scarred flesh stretched tight over prominent ribs. The poor creatures, weakened by disease and desperately hungry, would indeed attack livestock, though they consumed flesh like any predator, not blood like a vampire. The transformation from sick animal to legendary monster reveals how our minds fill gaps with the extraordinary. Media coverage amplified each sighting, artistic interpretations grew increasingly fantastical, and the Chupacabra evolved from a local mystery into a global phenomenon. Each retelling added new details, new terrors, until the truth became buried beneath layers of folklore. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine not a supernatural beast prowling through moonlit farms, but a mange-ridden coyote limping slowly across a warm desert landscape. Its patchy fur catches the starlight as it searches for an easy meal, more deserving of sympathy than fear. Sometimes the most frightening monsters are simply creatures struggling to survive, transformed by distance, darkness, and our very human need to find meaning in the mysterious. Rest easy knowing that even our most terrifying legends often have rather ordinary explanations. You're wandering through the Valley of the Kings at dawn, and there's this absolutely massive bird perched on a temple roof, glowing like it's been dipped in molten gold. That's basically how the ancient Egyptians first imagined the Bennu bird, their original phoenix, long before the Greeks got their hands on the story and made it all dramatic with the whole burning to death thing. The Bennu wasn't just any old bird. It was supposedly the soul of Ra himself, flying out of the primordial waters to land on the first mound of Earth. Pretty metal origin story, right? These weren't just random myths either. The Egyptians were obsessed with cycles. The Nile flooded every year, bringing life from apparent death. So naturally they'd dream up a bird that did the same thing but with more flair. When the Greeks heard about this Egyptian firebird, they couldn't leave well enough alone. They cranked up the drama to 11 and created the phoenix we know today, that magnificent crimson and gold creature that builds its own funeral pyre, burns to ash, then rises again 3 days later. Sound familiar? Early Christians absolutely loved this symbolism. Here was a pagan myth that perfectly illustrated resurrection, rebirth, and eternal life. They practically gift-wrapped the phoenix and handed it over to medieval artists, who painted it into illuminated manuscripts for centuries. But here's where it gets interesting, and slightly less mythical. Ornithologists have pointed out some fascinating parallels with real birds. Arabian golden eagles, for instance, go through this incredible molting process where they literally shed every single feather and regrow them all. During this time, they look pretty rough, bedraggled, patchy, like they're recovering from being set on fire. Then boom, perfect plumage returns. Even more compelling are the sunbirds of Africa and Asia. Their feathers shimmer with this incredible iridescent quality that shifts from gold to crimson to orange depending on the light. When they're feeding on nectar, hovering near flowers, they genuinely look like tiny flames dancing in the air. And then there's the environmental factor nobody talks about. Ancient civilizations regularly witnessed massive volcanic eruptions that would fill the sky with ash for days. When the sun finally broke through these ash clouds, it would turn the most incredible shade of deep red-orange. Any bird flying through that celestial light would appear to be literally on fire. So there they remain, these magnificent creatures of legend, perched above sleeping cities as dawn breaks. Each new feather catches the morning light, flickering between gold and scarlet, carrying whispers of ancient stories where death was never the end, just another beginning. In the flickering candlelight of medieval courtrooms, accused werewolves confessed to impossible transformations. They spoke of donning wolf pelts that fused with their skin, of midnight hunts where human thoughts dissolved into animal hunger. These weren't tales of Hollywood monsters, but desperate testimonies from people genuinely convinced they had become beasts. Court records from across Europe detail hundreds of such confessions, each more haunting than the last. The accused described the sensation of bones stretching, teeth sharpening, and an overwhelming urge to hunt. In France, Pierre Burgot claimed he rubbed a mysterious ointment on his body and immediately sprouted coarse hair. In Germany, Peter Stubb allegedly wore a magic belt that transformed him into a ravenous wolf. These weren't stories extracted under torture, though that certainly happened. Many confessions came voluntarily, from people tormented by memories they couldn't explain. Far from the witch trials, in the dense forests of the Baltic region, wolf belt rituals held different meanings. Here, shamanic traditions spoke of warriors who could channel wolf spirits, becoming fierce protectors of their tribes. Archaeological evidence suggests these ceremonies involved actual wolf pelts, worn during trance-like states where participants believed they embodied lupine qualities. Unlike the terrifying transformations described in court, these were sacred rites of passage, connecting humans to the wild wisdom of wolves. Modern science offers gentler explanations for these historical accounts. Rabies epidemics coincided remarkably with werewolf outbreak reports. The disease, transmitted through wolf bites, caused victims to develop hydrophobia, aggressive behavior, and disturbing changes in temperament. Even more intriguing is the connection to ergot poisoning. This fungus, growing on contaminated grain, produced powerful hallucinogens that could trigger vivid bestial visions. Entire villages consuming tainted bread might experience collective lycanthropic episodes. Then there's hypertrichosis, the rare genetic condition causing excessive hair growth across the entire body. Before modern medicine, people with this condition were often displayed in traveling shows as wolf people or living werewolves. Their dignified humanity was lost beneath sensationalized presentations that fed public fascination with transformation myths. But perhaps the most beautiful truth about werewolves lies not in courtrooms or circuses, but in quiet meadows where actual wolves roam freely. Under the gentle glow of a full moon, a pack moves through tall grass with ancient grace. Their eyes hold no malice, only the timeless wisdom of creatures perfectly adapted to their world. They pause, ears perked, sensing something beyond our understanding before continuing their eternal dance with the night. In their presence, the terror of old legends transforms into something far more profound, respect for the wild spaces that still call to something deep within us all. In the misty valleys of Eastern Europe, where ancient burial customs whispered through generations like secrets passed between sleeping children, the vampire was born not from imagination, but from the very real mysteries of death itself. Long before Bram Stoker's cape-swirling Count graced Victorian drawing rooms, Slavic villages knew something far more unsettling: the undead that refused to rest. Picture, if you will, the medieval practice of weighing down corpses with stones, of driving stakes through hearts, of filling mouths with garlic and holy water. These weren't superstitions born from boredom, but desperate measures against a phenomenon that seemed to follow families like a hereditary curse. When the dead appeared to move in their graves, when bodies emerged seemingly fresher than when buried, when strange wasting diseases swept through bloodlines, the only explanation that made sense was the most terrifying one. But science, that gentle insomniac, would eventually shed light on these nocturnal terrors. Porphyria, a blood disorder that made sufferers sensitive to sunlight and gave them a gaunt, pale appearance, explained many vampiric traits. Tuberculosis, with its telltale bloody cough and the way it seemed to drain life from entire families, created the perfect vampire epidemic. And perhaps most eerie of all, the natural decomposition process that caused corpses to bloat, forcing blood-tinged fluid from their mouths, blood that stained burial shrouds in patterns that looked disturbingly like drinking. The 18th century brought a peculiar form of detective work to European villages. Picture the scene: church bells tolling softly in the distance, lanterns flickering against tombstone shadows, and grave diggers working by moonlight to solve the mystery of the undead. These midnight exhumations were serious affairs, attended by doctors, clergy, and local officials, all seeking to understand why certain corpses seemed to resist decay, why their hair and nails appeared to grow longer, why they looked so remarkably alive. The vampires of folklore were simply the dead, doing what the dead have always done: decomposing, in ways that confused and frightened the living. When the doctor's lantern finally illuminated that freshly unearthed face, revealing soil-stained teeth instead of pointed fangs, ordinary decay instead of supernatural preservation, the vampire crumbled back into what it had always been: human misunderstanding meeting human mortality in the dark corners of the cemetery, where shadows play tricks on even the most rational minds. High in the Himalayas, where the air grows thin and the world falls silent beneath blankets of eternal snow, the Sherpa people have always known of the Métis. Long before Western explorers carved their names into these sacred peaks, whispered stories drifted through mountain villages like smoke from yak dung fires. The Métis wasn't quite man, wasn't quite beast, something in between, padding through the snow on feet too large, too deep, leaving traces that made even the bravest guides quicken their pace back to shelter. The creature walked upright through their folklore, covered in reddish-brown fur that caught the mountain light, standing taller than any human but moving with an intelligence that separated it from the bears that occasionally wandered these heights. Sherpa mothers would point to distant ridgelines and remind their children that some paths belonged to others, that the mountains held secrets older than memory. Then came the British mountaineers with their cameras and measuring tapes, their scientific certainty and plaster casting kits. In 1951, Eric Shipton photographed what appeared to be massive footprints in the snow near Everest Base Camp. The image went global overnight, 13 inches long, nearly twice the size of a human foot, with toes that seemed almost deliberately placed. Expeditions followed, each bringing back their own evidence. More photographs, hair samples caught on rocky outcrops, even more plaster casts of those impossible prints. The Royal Geographical Society took notice. Serious men in serious rooms examined the evidence with serious expressions, debating whether humanity had discovered its closest living relative, some remnant population of Gigantopithecus perhaps, hiding in the world's most remote corners. For decades, the mystery deepened with each expedition that returned with just enough evidence to keep the questions alive. But science has a way of unraveling even the most cherished mysteries. Genetic testing of those carefully preserved hair samples told a different story entirely. The DNA didn't point to unknown primates or evolutionary missing links. It matched Himalayan brown bears, particularly an isolated population living at extraordinary altitudes. These bears, it turned out, sometimes walked upright through deep snow to conserve energy, their massive paws creating prints that, when partially melted and refrozen, took on disturbingly human-like characteristics. The mirages didn't help either. At extreme altitudes, the thin air bends light in strange ways, making distant bears appear larger, more upright, more mysterious than they really are. Add the psychological effects of oxygen deprivation, the way avalanche booms can sound like massive footsteps echoing across the snowfields, and suddenly the mountains themselves become conspirators in the creation of legends. Tonight, somewhere high above the tree line, fresh snow falls into bear tracks that will, by morning, look like something else, entirely footprints of giants walking through dreams, filling slowly with drifting powder until even the mountains forget they were ever there. Captain Hendrik van der Berg pressed his quill against parchment, ink bleeding slightly in the humid Caribbean air of 1762. This day witnessed a most peculiar sight, he wrote, hand trembling not from the ship's gentle roll, but from what he'd seen. A serpent of impossible length, perhaps 30 meters or more, undulating beneath the waves like a ribbon of silver. The creature moved with purpose, its body catching sunlight in scales that seemed to shift from pewter to quicksilver. Van der Berg wasn't alone in his account. Ship logs from the 1700s overflow with similar descriptions, massive, elongated creatures spotted in deep waters worldwide. French naval records describe Le Serpent Ruban, the ribbon serpent, seen off Madagascar. British merchant vessels reported silver leviathans near the Azores. Spanish treasure galleons logged encounters with Serpiente de Plata in Pacific waters. Each account shared curious details. The creatures appeared before storms, moved with an undulating grace unlike any known sea life, and possessed an otherworldly luminescence that seemed to pulse beneath the waves. These weren't mere sailors' tales or rum-induced hallucinations. The observers were experienced mariners, men whose lives depended on accurate navigation and weather prediction. Yet science dismissed these accounts for centuries, filing them alongside kraken stories and mermaid sightings, until marine biologists finally met the ribbon serpent face to face. The oarfish, Regalicus glesnae, can grow up to 8 meters longer living silver ribbon, exactly as the old logs described. These serpentine giants normally dwell in the deep ocean's twilight zone, but something extraordinary happens before major storms. Changes in water pressure and temperature drive them toward the surface, where their metallic bodies catch filtered sunlight and seem to glow with an inner light. Their name comes from their elongated dorsal fins, which ripple like ribbons as they swim, creating the illusion of even greater length. Here's where physics plays its part in the mystery. Ocean swells create natural magnifying glasses wave troughs that bend and stretch images beneath the surface. A 6-meter oarfish, viewed through these moving lenses of water, can appear to stretch 30 meters or more. Add the creature's serpentine movement, its reflective scales, and the disorienting effect of a ship's motion, and you have the perfect recipe for sea serpent legends. Tonight, imagine yourself on calm tropical waters as evening approaches. The surface lies mirror-still, barely disturbed by gentle swells. Far below, a flash of silver catches your iron oarfish rising slowly through the blue depths, dorsal frill undulating like underwater flames, its ribbon body shimmering as it ascends toward the surface. bringing ancient mystery into the peaceful present moment. In the poisonous swamps of Lerna, where sulphurous mists clung to stagnant water like whispered curses, Heracles faced his most regenerative nightmare. The Hydra wasn't merely a serpent, it was a writhing mass of venomous heads that multiplied with each strike of his blade. Ancient texts describe the hero's growing horror as he realized his bronze sword only made the monster stronger, each severed neck birthing two more snapping maws dripping with lethal toxin. The creature's breath alone could kill a man, and its blood was so virulent that Heracles would later dip his arrows in it, creating weapons that inflicted incurable wounds. But perhaps the most unsettling detail wasn't the monster's poison, it was how its heads moved independently, each one seeking prey while the others watched and waited. Now, imagine stumbling upon a cluster of sea lampreys in shallow water. These primitive fish gather in writhing masses, their circular mouths opening and closing in eerie synchronization. From a distance, especially in murky water, such a cluster could easily appear as a single creature with multiple heads. Medieval travelers, encountering these eel-like swarms, might well have fled in terror, later spinning tales of regenerating monsters. But the most fascinating parallel comes from 18th century naturalists peering through their primitive microscopes at freshwater planariatony flatworms with an almost supernatural ability to regenerate. Cut one in half, and within days, you have two complete worms. Slice it into pieces, and each fragment grows into a new individual. These microscopic marvels fascinated early scientists like Abraham Tremblay, who documented their remarkable healing abilities with the same mixture of wonder and unease that ancient Greeks must have felt when contemplating the Hydra. Sometimes, reality proved even stranger than myth. Explorers in tropical regions occasionally discovered massive python, nest dozens of snakes coiled together in defensive balls, their heads weaving hypnotically above the mass. To exhausted, frightened travelers, glimpsing such a sight through morning mist, it would indeed appear as a single beast with countless heads, each one capable of swift, deadly strikes. And so we drift across a reed-lined pond at dusk, waters still save for a ripple of slender heads breaking the surface, perhaps fish, perhaps something more mysterious as twilight transforms the ordinary into the mythical once again. Picture the ancient trade routes threading through the Gobi Desert, where Scythian merchants once guided caravans heavy with gold between the distant courts of emperors. These men knew the desert's mood show; it could shift from gentle amber warmth to howling sandstorm fury in the span of an afternoon. They knew which rocks offered shelter, which springs hadn't run dry, and perhaps most importantly, they knew the stories whispered around campfires when the wind died down and the stars emerged like scattered coins across black silk. The Gobi wasn't just a passage for gold, it was a vast museum of bones. Walking these ancient routes today, you'd stumble across fossils emerging from weathered cliffs, like secrets the earth couldn't keep buried. Among the most striking discoveries are the skulls of Protoceratops creatures that lived roughly 70 million years ago. These weren't the towering dinosaurs of childhood imagination, but dog-sized herbivores with prominent beaks and sturdy four-legged builds. Their skulls, bleached by millennia of sun and scoured by sand, possess an almost mystical quality when half revealed in the ochre cliff faces. Imagine you're a Scythian nomad, exhausted from weeks of desert travel, your mind already primed by countless tales of monsters and magic. You're seeking shelter in a rocky outcrop when you spot something extraordinary, what appears to be the skull of a massive bird of prey, complete with fearsome beak, yet attached to what seems to be the body of a lion. The logical mind might eventually recognize bone for bone, but the tired, story-fed imagination sees something else entirely, a creature that once lived, breathed, and most importantly, guarded treasure with supernatural ferocity. These discoveries weren't mere curiosities. They became foundational myths. The griffin part eagle, part lion, all guardian emerged from these desert encounters as the ultimate protector of precious things. Scythian art began featuring these creatures prominently, not as fantastical inventions, but as known quantities, as real as the gold they supposedly guarded. Now evening settles over the Gobi like a familiar blanket, painting the horizon in shades of amber and rust. The wind performs its eternal task, grain by grain revealing what time had hidden. Sand cascades away from another ancient skull, its empty sockets catching the last light. For just a moment, in that golden hour between day and night, it's easy to imagine these stone sentinels stirring to life, spreading weathered wings against the dying sun, ready once again to guard treasures long since scattered to the desert winds. In the dusty archives of ancient Greek medicine, one name stands out for sheer audacity in the face of the impossible. Ctesias of Cnidus, court physician to Persian royalty, had a talent for turning dinner party anecdotes into zoological nightmares. Around 400 BCE, he penned accounts of a creature so terrifying that even hardened Persian warriors spoke of it in whispers. The manticore, literally man-eater in Persian. Picture, if you will, Tessia scribbling frantically by lamplight as some grizzled Persian scout describes this beast. A creature with the body of a lion, he writes, but with a human face twisted into a permanent, knowing smile. 3 rows of razor-sharp teeth, like a shark's mouth grafted onto something that shouldn't exist. And that tail bristling with venomous spines that could be launched like arrows, each one delivering death at 100 paces. The manticore, Ctesias claimed, was faster than a horse, stronger than an elephant, and clever enough to hunt humans specifically, savoring our flesh above all others. But here's where our sleepy detective story gets interesting. Imagine a Persian patrol, weary from weeks in the borderlands, catching a glimpse through a swirling dust storm. A flash of orange and black, massive and muscular, disappearing into tall grass. The tail always, that tail flicking and curling as it vanishes. What they're seeing, of course, is a Bengal tiger, one of nature's most perfect predators, but filtered through exhaustion, distance, and the kind of heat haze that makes mirages dance. The translation chaos that followed is almost comical. Persian scouts describing distinctive stripes become Greek scribes writing about defensive spines. The tiger's incredible leaping ability transforms into supernatural speed. That unnerving way tigers can seem to smile, combined with their eerily human-like eyes, becomes the manticore's disturbing human face. Layer upon layer of linguistic telephone, each retelling adding another impossible detail. And somewhere in the tall grass of what was once Persia, a tiger pads silently through the golden hour light. Its tail curls behind it like a question mark made of muscle and instinct, beautiful, dangerous, and utterly, magnificently real. In the Emerald Hills of Ireland, where morning mist clings to ancient stone like whispered secrets, the banshee has haunted folklore for centuries. Picture this ethereal woman, hair flowing like silver streams, her voice carrying across moonlit valleys in a mournful keen that chills the very soul. But here's where legend meets reality in the most delightfully unexpected way. The Irish tradition of keening, that raw, emotional wailing performed by women at funerals, forms the cultural backbone of banshee mythology. These professional mourners, called Bean Ceawaint, would arrive at wakes to voice the grief that families couldn't express themselves. Their haunting lamentations echoed through stone cottages, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that seemed to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. Now, imagine you're a weary traveler approaching an isolated Irish farmhouse on a fog-drenched evening. Suddenly, a bone-chilling shriek pierces the silence, high-pitched, warbling, utterly inhuman. Your heart pounds as you recall every banshee tale your grandmother ever whispered. But perched on the cottage's moss-covered windowsill sits the true culprit, a barn owl, its ghostly white feathers gleaming in the lamplight. Barn owls are nature's most accomplished ventriloquists. Their territorial calls can reach volumes that would make a rock concert jealous, up to 75 decibels at close range. These magnificent birds nest in the dark recesses of old stone buildings, emerging at twilight to hunt with supernatural silence. Their cries echo off cottage walls, creating acoustic tricks that can make a single owl sound like an entire chorus of the damned. Atlantic storms add another layer to this supernatural symphony. Wet air carries sound differently, distorting and amplifying it in ways that transform a simple barn owl's call into something that seems to emerge from the very fabric of the mist itself. Wind howling through ancient eaves mingles with these avian voices, creating an acoustic landscape that would convince even the most skeptical soul that spirits walk among us. As our imaginary traveler finally spots the true source of the haunting sound, The barn owl fixes him with those enormous dark eyes, ancient, wise, and utterly unbothered by its fearsome reputation. With movements as fluid as melting butter, it settles more comfortably on the weathered stone cross marking an old family grave, talons gripping gently, eyes slowly drifting half-closed in contented drowsiness, ready to keep its eternal, peaceful vigil through another Irish night. In the mist-shrouded mountains of ancient Japan, where cherry blossoms fall like whispered secrets, the people spoke in hushed tones of kitsune foxes that possessed far more than mere animal cunning. These weren't ordinary creatures padding through the undergrowth on silent paws. No, these were beings of transformation, mystery, and otherworldly intelligence that grew more powerful with each passing century. According to Shinto belief, a kitsune earned an additional tail for every 100 years it lived, until the most ancient among them boasted 9 magnificent plumes. Picture, if you will, a crimson fox emerging from morning fog, its multiple tails fanned like silk banners, each one a testament to decades of accumulated wisdom and supernatural might. These elder kitsune could slip between forms as easily as you or I might change clothes, appearing as beautiful women in flowing kimono one moment, mischievous children the next, or wise old men with knowing smiles. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of kitsune encounters wasn't their shape-shifting abilities, but their voices. Farmers working late in rice paddies would freeze at the sound of laughter echoing across the water-distinctly human mirth that seemed to bubble up from nowhere. The sound would dance between the stalks, now close, now distant, as if the very air itself had learned to giggle. Some claimed they could distinguish words in the laughter, snippets of conversation in dialects older than memory. Modern scholars suggest several explanations for these eerie encounters. Rabies outbreaks among fox populations could explain erratic behavior and the association with madness. The disease affects the vocal cords, producing sounds that might indeed seem disturbingly human-like in the still night air. Additionally, moonlit sake festivals, where rice wine flowed freely and inhibitions dissolved, created perfect conditions for misidentification and embellished storytelling. Yet even today, in quiet moments beside babbling streams, you might glimpse a flash of red fur between bamboo stalks. There, in that peaceful grove where paper lanterns bob downstream like fallen stars, a lone fox sits motionless, watching. Its dark eyes reflect ancient mysteries, and you can't quite shake the feeling that it's counting perhaps the years, perhaps the tales yet to come. In that suspended moment, the boundary between myth and reality becomes as delicate as morning dew on spider silk. In the shadowed corners of Edo, Japan, where paper screens filtered amber light and sake warmed cold nights, travelers whispered of the jaw, Gumoth spider-woman who spun webs not just of silk, but of desire itself. These weren't mere ghost stories shared around dying embers. They were urgent warnings passed from merchant to merchant, each tale more elaborate than the last. Picture, if you will, a lone traveler stumbling through moonlit bamboo groves, perhaps a bit too fond of the local rice wine. Through the mist appears a vision, a woman of impossible beauty, her kimono shimmering like captured starlight, beckoning from a traditional dwelling that seems to materialize from nowhere. Her movements are hypnotic, graceful beyond human capability, and her smile, well, her smile promises secrets that mortal men were never meant to know. But as our traveler draws closer, enchanted beyond reason, the illusion begins to fray at the edges. The woman's fingers stretch just a bit too long, her eyes reflect light like polished obsidian, and when she laughs, it carries the subtle clicking of mandibles. The beautiful dwelling reveals itself as an elaborate web, strong enough to trap not just insects, but men foolish enough to follow desire into darkness. These tales weren't entirely born from imagination, though the truth is perhaps more wonderful than fiction. Golden orb-weaver spiders, specifically Nephila clavata, actually roamed Japan's forests, creating webs so large and strong they could indeed snare small birds. These remarkable arachnids, with leg spans reaching nearly 5 inches, wove semi-permanent webs that glittered like golden thread in sunlight, webs that could easily catch a sparrow or even a small bat for dinner. The perfect storm for Jaw, Gumo sightings came from a peculiar combination of Edo period elements: traditional lacquered masks used in no theatre, flickering candlelight that danced shadows into impossible shapes, and the visual distortions that came with a bit too much sake. A large spider in her web, caught in just the right light, with the observer's perception altered by rice, wine, and cultural expectations, could indeed appear as something far more supernatural than nature intended. And so the legend persisted, weaving itself into the cultural fabric as surely as any spider spins her web. Today, morning dew still catches on orb-weaver webs throughout Japan, each droplet refracting light like tiny prisms, the silk swaying gently in morning breezes that carry no whispers of ancient warnings, only the quiet beauty of nature's most patient hunters. Picture the slow drift between myth and memory, where creatures transform not through evolution but through the gentle erosion of storytelling. The sirens began as something quite different from the fish-tailed temptresses we know today. In Homer's time, they were birds with women's faces, perched on rocky outcrops, their feathered wings catching Mediterranean breezes as they sang sailors toward their doom. These weren't mermaids lounging on sun-warmed stones. The original sirens were hybrid beings of air and song, creatures that understood the power of voice carried on wind. Ancient Greeks imagined them as large as eagles, with human intelligence gleaming in their dark eyes, positioned strategically where acoustic properties of cliffsides could amplify their calls across miles of open water. But stories, like tides, reshape everything they touch repeatedly. By the Renaissance, artists had begun drawing sirens with scales instead of feathers, tails instead of talons. Perhaps this transformation reflected humanity's growing fascination with the depths rather than the heights. Or maybe painters found fish more exotic than birds in their landlocked studios. The change happened gradually, each retelling adding a fin here, removing a wing there, until the sky-dwelling singers became ocean dwellers entirely. Consider the exhausted sailor, weeks into a voyage, listening to the endless conversation between wind and water. Gull cries echo strangely when bounced off limestone cliffs. The human brain, starved of variety, begins interpreting these sounds as voices, as music, as promises of companionship. What seemed supernatural to ancient mariners might simply have been the acoustic phenomenon of tired minds making sense of repetitive natural sounds. Yet the siren's influence extended beyond hallucination. Shipbuilders carved their vessels with figureheads depicting beautiful women, faces turned forward into unknown waters. These wooden singers served as both protection and invitation, embodying the same duality as their mythical inspiration. They promised safe passage while acknowledging the sea's power to seduce and destroy. Today, if you stand on any empty shore where waves meet stone, you can hear it still. The rhythm of breakers against rocks creates something almost musical, a slow percussion that sounds remarkably like distant lullabies. Perhaps that's all the sirens ever were, the ocean's own voice, singing sailors towards sleep that some would wake from and others would not. The sea keeps its ancient song, whether we call it singers, birds or fish or simply waves. In the hushed twilight of old Japan, mothers would pull their children close and whisper warnings about the river children. These weren't ordinary youngsters splashing in shallow waters, but something far more unsettling. The kappa, they called them, creatures with bowl-shaped heads that held their life force in water, webbed hands stronger than any humans, and an insatiable hunger for more than just river fish. Parents warned that kappa lurked in deep ponds and rushing streams, waiting to drag unsuspecting children beneath the surface. They spoke of creatures no taller than a 10-year-old, with turtle-like shells and an eerily polite manner, for kappa were said to bow deeply when greeted, spilling the precious water from their head bowls and losing their supernatural strength. It was a peculiar vulnerability for such fearsome beings, but then again, the most dangerous predators often hide behind the most innocent facades. What's fascinating is how closely these ancient warnings match a very real inhabitant of Japanese waters. Deep in the mountain streams and ancient ponds, Japanese giant salamanders grow to extraordinary sizes, some reaching 5 feet in length, with broad, flattened heads that could easily be mistaken for bowls in murky water. Their skin is mottled and ancient-looking like living stones, and they move with surprising speed when hunting. These massive amphibians are indeed dangerous to anything small enough to fit in their cavernous mouths. They're ambush predators, lying motionless on river bottoms before lunging with lightning speed. Their bite is powerful enough to break bones, and they show remarkable intelligence in their hunting strategies. Perhaps most tellingly, villages near kappa habitats traditionally left cucumber offerings by the water's edge, cucumbers being, according to folklore, the kappa's favorite food. It's a curious detail that becomes less mysterious when you learn that Japanese giant salamanders are particularly fond of fish, frogs, and yes, vegetation that falls into their aquatic domain. The ritual of offering cucumbers might have begun as a way to appease these very real river guardians, ensuring safe passage through their territory. Tonight, imagine standing on an ancient wooden bridge, lanterns casting dancing shadows on the dark water below. The surface remains perfectly still, disturbed only by the gentlest lapping against moss-covered stones. In that peaceful silence, it's easy to forget that somewhere beneath those calm waters, patient eyes might be watching, waiting with the endless patience that only the truly ancient possess. Listen. Do you hear that distant rumble rolling across the plains? That's not just thunder you're hearing tonight. That's the echo of something far older, far more magnificent than any storm cloud. Long before meteorology textbooks explained atmospheric pressure, the Algonquin peoples carved massive birds into sacred stones. These weren't decorative flourishes or artistic whimsy. These were warnings. Promises. The Lakota spoke of Wakinyan wings, so vast they blocked out entire skies, talons that could crack mountains like eggshells. From the Pacific Northwest to the Great Lakes, every indigenous culture seemed to remember the same impossible thing: birds that commanded storms that were storms. Now, you might think this is where we dismiss ancient wisdom as mere folklore, but in 1952, something extraordinary emerged from the La Brea tar pits: Teratornis merriami, a real bird. A real, impossible bird with a wingspan stretching 4 meters 13 feet of prehistoric terror gliding through Pleistocene skies. This wasn't some sparrow with delusions of grandeur. This was a condor's nightmare, a vulture's fever dream, soaring over landscapes where saber-toothed cats prowled and mammoths trumpeted. But here's where it gets deliciously fascinating. Those ancient storytellers weren't just remembering extinct megafauna, they were capturing something even more ephemeral. Picture this. You're standing on an endless prairie as storm systems build on the horizon. Roll clouds stretch across the sky like impossible wings. Sheet lightning illuminates massive silhouettes, birds that exist only in backlit moments, creatures of shadow and electricity that vanish the instant you try to focus on them. The thunderbird wasn't just a memory of Teratornis, it was the marriage of fossil truth and atmospheric poetry. Ancient peoples found those massive bones, those impossible wingspans, and then looked up at storm clouds that seemed to move with purpose, with intelligence. They connected dots across deep time, creating mythology that was part paleontology, part meteorology, all reverence. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine yourself on that ancient prairie. The thunder rumbles again, slower now, more rhythmic, like the breathing of something unimaginably large. Somewhere between the fossil record and the lightning-split sky, between science and story, the thunderbird spreads its wings once more. 4 meters of shadow and legend, carrying storms on feathers made of memory and rain. Close your eyes, listen to that distant thunder. It's getting softer now, gentler, like a lullaby from the Pleistocene. Deep beneath the Mediterranean sun, on the island of Crete, lie the ruins of Knossosa Palace, so vast and complex that even today, wandering its reconstructed corridors feels like stepping into a dream. Here, some 4,000 years ago, the Minoan civilization flourished, and here too the legend of the Minotaur was born. But let's start not with the monster, but with the frescoes. Painted in vivid blues and ochres across palace walls, these ancient artworks show something extraordinary. Young athletes, both male and female, performing death, defying leaps over charging bulls. They vault over the animals' horns, somersault along their backs, land gracefully on the other side. It's breathtaking, impossible, and yet there it is, preserved in pigment and plaster. The bull was sacred to the Minoans. Archaeological evidence suggests elaborate bull worship rituals, sacrificial ceremonies, and yes, quite possibly those spectacular acrobatic displays. Bulls represented power, fertility, the raw force of nature, much like the earthquakes that regularly shook this volcanic island. Now, picture yourself walking through Knossos in its heyday. A sprawling complex of over 1,000 rooms, winding staircases, dead-end passages, storage chambers branching off in all directions. Even with torches, even with guides, you'd get lost. The palace wasn't designed for easy navigation. It was a statement of power, a display of wealth, so overwhelming it confused visiting dignitaries. Then came the earthquakes. Massive tremors collapsed walls, blocked passages, twisted the already complex layout into something truly labyrinthine. What had been confusing became impossible. Corridors that once led to grand halls now ended abruptly in rubble. Rooms became isolated chambers. The palace transformed into an actual maze. Centuries later, when Bronze Age Greeks encountered these ruins, they needed an explanation for such an impossible structure. Why would anyone build something so bewildering? The answer came in the form of myth. Surely only a monster would require such a prison. And what monster? Well, the Minoans had worshipped bulls, hadn't they? Their walls were covered with bull imagery. Perhaps they'd created something terrible, something that was part man, part beast. Modern scholars suggest these human-animal hybrid myths might reflect deeper cultural taboo spheres about crossing boundaries, about what happens when civilized society meets primal nature. The Minotaur wasn't just a monster in a maze. It was a manifestation of ancient anxieties about identity, about what it means to be human. Tonight, as evening settles over Knossos, shadows stretch across those ancient corridors. Dust motes drift lazily through shafts of fading light, and for just a moment, you can almost hear the echo of hoofbeats in the stone passages. Almost. It's the year 565, and St. Columba is paddling across the dark waters of Loch Ness when something enormous surfaces nearby. His chroniclers would later describe a water beast that retreated only when the holy man commanded it to flee. 14 centuries later, we're still peering into those same inky depths, wondering what exactly good old Columba encountered on that misty Scottish morning. The modern Nessie phenomenon really took off in the 1930s, when the famous surgeon's photograph appeared to show a graceful neck emerging from the loch. Suddenly, everyone was a monster hunter. Tourists flocked to the highlands armed with cameras, binoculars, and an unhealthy obsession with ripples. Weekly sightings became as regular as afternoon tea, each witness absolutely convinced they'd spotted something extraordinary lurking beneath the surface. But here's where science gets deliciously pedantic. Those mysterious humps moving across the water, often they're seiches, essentially the loch's own version of a very slow, very large bathtub slosh. Wind pushes water to one end, creating waves that can travel back and forth for hours, producing the illusion of something massive moving through the depths. Then there are the floating logs, which bob and weave with suspicious animation, especially when viewed through the romantic haze of Scottish mist. Perhaps most intriguingly, the loch's resident sturgeon population creates plesiosaur-shaped wakes when they surface to breathe. These ancient fish can grow impressively large, and their dorsal fins cutting through the water create exactly the sort of serpentine disturbance that sends cryptozoologists into raptures. Add some atmospheric distortion, a bit of wishful thinking, and voila, you've got yourself a living dinosaur. Sonar surveys have crisscrossed the loch countless times, revealing its secrets with disappointing clarity. The deepest parts hold only sediment ridges, fallen trees, and the occasional discarded shopping trolley. No air-breathing reptiles, no hidden caverns, no prehistoric survivors munching on salmon in the depths. Yet as night falls and the tourists depart, Loch Ness transforms into something genuinely magical. The water becomes a perfect mirror, reflecting moonlight in silver ribbons that stretch across its surface. In these moments of absolute stillness, when not even the slightest breeze disturbs the glass-like calm, you almost understand why people see monsters here. Sometimes the most beautiful mysteries are the ones that exist purely in our imagination. In the mist-shrouded mountains of Qing dynasty China, when death claimed someone far from home, their families faced a terrible dilemma. How do you bring a loved one back for proper burial, when the journey takes weeks through treacherous terrain? The answer came in the form of corpse transporters, professionals who specialized in moving the dead across vast distances using a method that would later inspire countless ghost stories. These transporters, known as corpse drivers or corpse walkers, developed an ingenious, if macabre, solution. They would bind the deceased in white burial shrouds, then attach bamboo poles to create a rigid frame. Working in pairs, they'd carry these wrapped bodies through mountain passes and village streets, moving only at night to avoid disturbing the living. But here's where reality becomes stranger than fiction. Sometimes they traveled alone, and witnesses swore the corpses moved by themselves. The secret lay in rigor mortis and clever engineering. As decomposition progressed, the body's stiffening limbs would lock into position. The transporters learned to position the corpse so that each jarring step of their carrier would cause the rigid body to bounce forward in a grotesque hopping motion. From a distance, especially in moonlight, it appeared the dead were leaping alongside their escorts, arms outstretched and legs moving in unison. But the most unsettling aspect wasn't the movement, it was the glow. Travelers reported seeing faint green light emanating from these hopping figures as they bounded through the darkness. The explanation lies in chemistry, not supernatural forces. Bodies buried in shallow graves or transported through humid conditions often developed patches of foxfire, bioluminescent fungi that thrived on decaying organic matter. Phosphorus compounds in decomposing flesh would sometimes create an eerie luminescence, especially visible against white burial shrouds. These sightings became the foundation for Jiangxi legends, reanimated corpses that hop because their legs have stiffened in death, glowing with otherworldly energy as they hunt the living. The stories spread through every village and tea house, growing more elaborate with each telling. Tonight, in an ancient temple courtyard somewhere in rural China, a paper lantern flickers and dies. The sudden darkness reveals nothing but weathered stone and overgrown gardens. Yet somewhere in that silence, between the chirping of night insects and the whisper of wind through bamboo, you might hear the distant sound of something heavy landing on packed earth, once, twice, getting closer. In the narrow alleys of 16th century Prague, where shadows danced between crumbling synagogues and the Vltava River whispered secrets to its banks, Rabbi Judah Lu ben Bezalel knelt beside the murky waters. The year was 1580, and the Jewish quarter faced another wave of persecution. But this learned man, steeped in Kabbalah and mathematics, had found his answer not in prayer alone, but in the very earth beneath his feet. The rabbi's hands worked the river mud with methodical precision, his fingers tracing the outline of what would become legend. Clay clung to his robes as he shaped shoulders broad enough to bear the weight of protection, arms strong enough to shield the innocent. Hour by hour, the form took shape massive, imposing, yet somehow incomplete. When the final feature was carved, Rabbi Lowe whispered the sacred name, the Shem, pressing the holy word written on parchment beneath the creature's tongue. They say the clay chest rose and fell with its first breath, and ancient eyes opened to survey a world that had called it into being. This wasn't Prague's first brush with artificial life. Across medieval Europe, clockwork saints performed mechanical miracles in cathedral squares, their brass arms blessing crowds on feast days. Alchemists in distant towers claimed to birth homunculi in glass vessels, tiny humans swimming in philosophical mercury. The golem belonged to this strange family of created beings, yet it stood apart, born not of gears and springs, but of faith and desperation. The Hebrew word itself holds secrets. Golem means unfinished, unshaped, like the incomplete manuscripts that lined Rabbi Lowe's study, their margins filled with half-formed thoughts and abandoned calculations. Perhaps that's what made the golem so powerful. It was potential incarnate, raw possibility given form and purpose. In the end, when its work was done, the golem returned to dust. But if you wander through Prague's old quarter today, past workshops where craftsmen still shape clay with patient hands, you might notice something curious. On the highest shelves, barely visible in the lamplight, sit rows of half-carved face expressions caught between sleeping and waking, waiting for the word that brings them home. In the ancient tablets of Ugarit, carved before Rome was even a gleam in a wolf's eye, scribes told of Lotana writhing chaos serpent with 7 heads, each one breathing salt and storm. This wasn't your garden variety dragon lounging on a pile of gold coins. No, Lotan dwelt in the deepest trenches where sunlight had never dared to venture, coiling through underwater canyons like a living mountain range with anger management issues. The Hebrews inherited this watery nightmare and gave it a promotion. In their scriptures, Leviathan became God's own pet projector creature, so magnificently terrible that its very existence served as a reminder of divine power. Job got an entire chapter-long lecture about it, probably while nursing his boils and wondering if maybe he should have kept his mouth shut about the whole righteousness thing. But here's where mythology meets reality in the most delightfully messy way possible. Picture this: ancient sailors, already 3 sheets to the wind from whatever passed for grog in 800 BCE, suddenly witness a sperm whale erupting from the depths like a 60-foot torpedo with teeth. These behemoths don't just surface, they explode upward in geysers of foam and fury, their block-shaped heads crashing back down with the force of a collapsing temple. Even more spectacular, imagine witnessing the legendary battles between sperm whales and giant squids. In the crushing darkness of the deep ocean, these titans clash in wrestling matches that would make Greek heroes weep with envy. The whale, scarred by tentacle sucker, marks the size of dinner plates, bears the evidence of these epic encounters on its hide like badges of honor. Those scars, etched deep into leathery skin by harpoons and kraken beaks alike, must have seemed like armor plating to terrified fishermen. Each raised welt and puckered wound told stories of battles fought in realms beyond human comprehension. No wonder they imagined impenetrable scales protecting a beast that could swallow ships whole. But perhaps the most haunting evidence lies in their songs, those deep, resonant calls that travel for miles through the ocean's depths. To sailors drifting in the dark, these whale songs might have sounded like the mournful hymns of Leviathan itself, a lullaby for the drowned. In the mist-shrouded lochs of Scotland, where peat-dark waters stretch like obsidian mirrors beneath brooding hills, there lived creatures that blurred the line between salvation and doom. The kelpie, that most treacherous of water horses, would emerge from the depths on foggy evenings when visibility dropped to mere yards and sound carried strangely across the water. Picture this: a weary traveller approaches the loch's edge, boots squelching in the boggy ground. Through the swirling mist, a magnificent black mare stands knee-deep in the shallows, her coat gleaming wet, her eyes dark pools of seeming gentleness. She appears tame, even eager for a rider. What harm could there be in mounting such a noble beast for the journey ahead? But the moment the traveller swings a leg over her back, the kelpie's true nature reveals itself. Her skin becomes adhesive as tree sap, trapping the rider completely. With supernatural strength, she plunges backward into the loch's deepest parts, dragging her victim down through increasingly cold layers until lungs fill with that same peat-dark water and bones settle into the silted bottom alongside countless others. Yet perhaps there's a more earthbound explanation hiding in these tales. Scotland's lochs teem with seal-sleek, dark creatures that surface unexpectedly, their whiskered faces appearing almost horse-like through shifting fog. Add the optical tricks of peat-stained water, where depths become impossible to judge, and you have all the ingredients for mistaken identity. Many a confident swimmer has discovered too late that what appeared to be shallow water actually dropped away into hidden depths carved by ancient glaciers. The Kelpie legends served a vital purpose in Highland communities. Parents would weave these stories around winter fires, voices dropping to whispers as they described those adhesive flanks and that final, fatal ride. Children learned to approach unfamiliar waters with respect, to check depth carefully, to never trust appearances when mist rolled in from the mountains. These weren't just scary stories, they were survival guides wrapped in Celtic knots of narrative. Even now, on certain evenings when low clouds kiss the loch's surface and visibility fades to nothing, locals speak of seeing shapes that don't quite fit. A disturbance in the water that moves against the wind, ripple rings expanding outward from no visible source, growing wider and wider until they kiss the shore with the gentlest of whispers. Then, only silence remains. In the high desert country of the American Southwest, where red rock spires pierce endless sky and ancient mazes hold secrets older than memory, there exists a darkness that most refuse to name. The Dine people, whom outsiders call Navajo, speak of it only in whispers, if at all. They call it Ye-nald-lushithe, one who travels on all fours. But you might know it by another name entirely, one that carries the weight of Hollywood horror and campfire tales, the Skinwalker. But before we venture down this moonlit path together, let's pause to understand what we're really talking about. This isn't some creature born from imagination or legend, passed down through generations of storytelling. This is something far more complex, far more human, and infinitely more unsettling. Because a skinwalker, in traditional Navajo belief, is not a monster at all, it's a person. In Navajo tradition, becoming a skinwalker requires crossing the most sacred of boundaries, committing acts so fundamentally opposed to the harmony that governs Diné life that the very speaking of them is considered dangerous. These are practitioners of the darkest witchcraft, individuals who have chosen to violate the most basic taboos of their culture. To become Ye-nald-lushi, one must commit the ultimate transgression, the murder of a close family member, often a sibling. Once this line is crossed, the skinwalker gains the ability to don the pelts of animals and take their form. They might become a coyote slinking through sagebrush, an owl gliding silent through moonlight, or a wolf padding across desert stone. But this power comes at the cost of their humanity, their place in the community, their very soul. Picture this, if you will. You're camping in the vast emptiness of the Four Corners region, where Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico meet in a landscape so ancient it feels like the bones of the earth itself. The fire crackles before you, orange light dancing across weathered rock faces that have watched over this land for millions of years. Above, the Milky Way spreads like scattered silver dust across a sky so clear and dark that city dwellers can scarcely imagine it. Then you see it. A coyote, larger than it should be, padding with unsettling purpose through your camp. It doesn't scavenge for scraps or skitter away from the firelight as any normal coyote would. Instead, it seems to study you with an intelligence that makes your skin crawl. And then this is where the stories always take their darkest turn. You might hear laughter echoing across the mesas. Human laughter, but wrong somehow, distorted by distance, and something far more sinister. For generations, the Diné have known to fear such encounters. Not because of some ancient superstition, but because skinwalkers, as they understand them, are real people who have chosen evil. They are the ones who operate outside the bounds of society, who use their knowledge of traditional practices for malevolent purposes, who inspire terror through their very existence. But here's where our modern understanding often goes astray. When European settlers and later anthropologists began documenting Native American traditions, they frequently misunderstood what they were being told. The concept of the skinwalker was complex, deeply tied to specific cultural and spiritual beliefs that outsiders couldn't fully grasp. So they simplified it, categorized it, turned it into something more familiar to Western minds: a monster, a supernatural creature, a thing that goes bump in the night. These colonial misreadings had consequences that echo to this day. The nuanced understanding of Ye-nald-lushi as a human practitioner of forbidden arts became flattened into generic shapeshifter mythology. Different tribes, distinct traditions were blended together into a single, homogenized skinwalker legend that bore little resemblance to its origins. Hollywood picked up these distorted versions and ran with them, creating the skinwalker of popular culture, part werewolf, part generic Native American mysticism, entirely divorced from its actual meaning. As our imaginary desert night deepens and the fire burns lower, casting ever longer shadows across the ancient landscape, consider the tragedy in this transformation. A real aspect of Navajo culture, their understanding of how people can choose evil, how communities must deal with those who violate sacred laws, became reduced to just another monster in the catalogue of supernatural horrors. The desert around us grows quiet now, silent, save for the distant call of a single coyote somewhere among the mesas. Is it just an animal going about its nightly business, or is it something more? In the end, perhaps the most unsettling truth about skinwalkers is not that they might be supernatural creatures lurking in the darkness, but that they represent something all too humanthy, capacity for people to choose a path that puts them fundamentally at odds with their community, their culture, and their own humanity. The fire crackles lower now, and the Milky Way wheels slowly overhead, unchanged since long before humans walked this sacred land. The desert keeps its secrets, and some stories, perhaps, are meant to remain in the shadows where they belong. You're trudging through desert sand at twilight, and there it is, a massive stone creature with a woman's head, eagle's wings, and a lion's body, just waiting. The Sphinx wasn't just decorating Egyptian pyramids for Instagram likes. This riddle-loving, traveler-devouring beast had a job to do, and she took it very seriously indeed. Now, the Greeks and Egyptians couldn't quite agree on what exactly a sphinx was supposed to be. The Egyptian version was generally more chiller, benevolent guardian watching over tombs and sacred sites, occasionally moonlighting as a royal advisor. Think of her as ancient Egypt's ultimate bouncer, but with better conversation skills. The Greek Sphinx, however, was absolutely not having a good time. She'd perch herself on rocks near Thebes, asking travelers her famous riddle about what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 at noon and 3 in the evening. Get it wrong? Well, let's just say the travel insurance industry hadn't been invented yet. But here's where things get interesting. Archaeologists have found something rather curious: natural rock outcrops throughout the Mediterranean that look suspiciously like crouching lions when the light hits them just right. Desert winds and centuries of erosion can sculpt sandstone into remarkably feline shapes, complete with what might pass for a regal head and haunches. When early travelers spotted these formations during sandstorms or at dusk, with shadows dancing and imagination running wild, suddenly that innocent rock outcrop became something far more ominous. The connection to Delphi's oracle adds another delicious layer to this mystery. The Pythia, that famous prophet who delivered cryptic pronouncements while high on volcanic fumes, was often depicted with sphinx-like qualities, a wise woman with an otherworldly aura, speaking in riddles that made about as much sense as modern assembly instructions. The Greeks loved their symbolic mashups, and the Sphinx became the perfect representation of divine feminine wisdom wrapped in enigmatic, slightly terrifying packaging. So tonight, when the moon waxes full and desert winds whisper across ancient trade routes, imagine those same forces still at work. Sand shifts, shadows play tricks, and for just a moment, you might glimpse what our ancestors saw: a creature of stone and starlight, eternal and waiting, ready to challenge any soul brave enough to answer her riddle in the pale lunar glow. In the sun-scorched realm of ancient Libya, where the Mediterranean lapped against shores that knew secrets older than memory, there ruled a queen whose beauty could stop wars. Lamia possessed the kind of radiance that made poets weep and kings abandon kingdoms, which, as these stories tend to go, proved to be her undoing. Zeus, that eternal wanderer of both heavens and hearts, noticed her gleaming like a jewel against the North African sands. But Zeus's wife Hera had developed quite the talent for creative punishment over the millennia. When she discovered her husband's latest infatuation, she didn't simply rage or storm off to Olympus. No, Hera crafted something far more exquisite in its cruelty. She cursed Lamia with an uncontrollable hunger, not for food, not for power, but for children. The queen who had once cradled her own babies would now devour any child she encountered, compelled by a force she couldn't resist. Picture the horror of it. Lamia, aware of what she was becoming, watching her own hands reach for the innocent. The transformation wasn't just spiritual. Her lower body twisted into that of a serpent, scales replacing skin, leaving her trapped between human consciousness and monstrous appetite. She haunted the borderlands between civilization and wilderness, a cautionary tale whispered by mothers to keep children close after dark. Nature, it seems, had already written this story in blood and bone. High above Mediterranean cliffs, Lammergeier vultures circle on thermals, their own feeding habits eerily reminiscent of the mythical queen. These magnificent birds carry bones to tremendous heights, then drop them onto rocks below, shattering them to access the marrow within. Ancient peoples watching these aerial displays might well have seen Lamia in the vulture's methodical, almost ritualistic feeding creatures that consumed what others wouldn't dare touch. As Mediterranean cultures merged and mingled, snake cults absorbed Lamia's essence, transforming her from individual monster into archetypal force. She became the serpent goddess who demanded tribute, the scaled mother who both protected and threatened. Her story slithered through generations, adapting, evolving, becoming more than legend, becoming warning. And so the tale dissolves like sea foam, leaving only the cry of gulls above sun-bleached cliffs where shadows stretch long into evening. Somewhere between the bone-white stones and the endless blue, Lamia's hunger echoes still. In the cosmic theatre of Hindu mythology, no creature commands the heavens quite like Garuda. Picture this magnificent being, part eagle, part man, with wings that eclipse the sun and talons that could cradle mountains. The ancient Ramayana describes him as Vishnu's faithful mount, a golden-feathered chariot capable of crossing the three worlds in a single heartbeat. When Garuda spreads his wings, the scriptures tell us, the very air becomes turbulent with divine energy, and mortals below mistake his shadow for an eclipse. But here's where myth kisses reality with surprising tenderness. The Brahmani kite, sacred across South Asia, bears an uncanny resemblance to these ancient descriptions. Watch one of these raptors circle a temple complex at dawn, its russet and white plumage catching the light like burnished gold, its piercing cry echoing across courtyards, and you'll understand why temple sculptors reached for their chisels. Meanwhile, high in the Himalayas, the griffon vulture soars on thermals with wings spanning nearly 10 feet, hovering motionless against impossible blue skies. To pilgrims trudging mountain paths, these giants appear almost supernatural, suspended between earth and heaven like living prayers. The real magic happens during monsoon season, when physics performs its own divine dance. Massive thermal columns rise from sun-heated valleys, creating invisible highways in the sky. A Brahmani kite riding these updrafts can hover absolutely still for minutes at a time, wings barely moving, defying every earthly expectation of flight. To ancient observers, this would have seemed nothing short of miraculous, a creature freed from the laws that bind the rest of us to dust and gravity. Even today, in temple courtyards across India, you'll hear the sudden rustle of ancient banyan leaves as a kite glides overhead, casting its shadow across worn stone steps. Children pause their games, vendors look up from their stalls, and for just a moment, everyone remembers that some mysteries are best left unexplained. Perhaps Garuda never truly left Ush, simply learned to hide in plain sight, wearing different feathers but carrying the same eternal message. That somewhere between earth and sky lies a realm where the impossible feels perfectly at home. Picture yourself beside an ancient billabong at twilight, where the water sits perfectly still except for the occasional ripple from a diving duck. For thousands of years, Aboriginal peoples have whispered about the Bunyapa creature that calls these sacred waterholes home. The descriptions vary between tribes, but the essence remains constant. Something large and powerful dwells beneath the surface, announcing its presence with a bone-deep roar that echoes across the water like distant thunder. The Bunyip's reputation wasn't built on imagination alone. When European paleontologists began excavating around these same billabongs in the 1800s, they unearthed something remarkable. Massive skulls and femurs emerged from the clay remains of Diprotodon, a rhinoceros-sized marsupial that grazed these lands until about 25,000 years ago. Even more intriguing were the Palochestes fossils, belonging to strange tapir-like creatures with powerful claws and elongated snouts. These ancient giants had indeed called the water's edge home, their bones slowly settling into the very mud where Bunyip stories were born. But the mystery deepens when we consider what early colonists witnessed firsthand. During particularly wet seasons, when rivers swelled and connected inland waterways to distant coasts, something extraordinary happened. Seals, following fish runs, would travel hundreds of miles upstream into areas where no marine mammal belonged. Imagine a settler's shock at encountering a 6-foot leopard seal hauled out beside a freshwater billabong, its alien bulk and haunting calls echoing across the water at dusk. These unexpected visitors, combined with half-glimpsed ancient memories encoded in the landscape itself, painted a picture far stranger than fiction. As night settles over the billabong now, the water returns to its eternal stillness. The only sounds are the gentle symphony of frogs beginning their evening chorus, green tree frogs with their distinctive calls, and the occasional plop of a water dragon sliding from a log. The reeds sway in the slight breeze, creating the softest whisper across the surface. Whether the bunyip was ancient megafauna, displaced seals, or something that exists in the spaces between memory and reality. Its presence lingers here in the quiet spaces where water meets land, where stories become truth and truth becomes legend. Along the muddy banks of the Nile, where papyrus whispers secrets to the evening breeze, ancient Egyptians knew that death was merely a doorway, but not everyone who knocked would be allowed to pass through. In the depths of the afterlife, in a hall that stretched beyond mortal comprehension, the gods conducted their most sacred ceremony. Picture this scene unfolding in eternal twilight, the deceased soul, trembling and translucent, standing before a great golden scale. On one side, their heart still beating with the memory of every deed, every kindness, every cruelty. On the other, a single white feather, light as air yet heavy with the weight of universal justice. This was the weighing of the heart, overseen by 42 divine judges whose eyes missed nothing. The god Anubis, with his jackal head and steady hands, would lift the heart with infinite care and place it upon the scale. The feather belonged to Ma'at, goddess of truth and order, and if the heart proved heavier than her Tokenif, it was bloated with sins and selfishness, then the soul's fate was sealed. Waiting in the shadows stood Ammit, the eater of hearts. She was no single creature but a fusion of three, each representing a different terror that haunted the Egyptian night. Her head was that of a massive Nile crocodile, with jaws that could snap a boat in half and teeth like ivory daggers. Her torso belonged to a lioness, powerful and golden, muscles rippling beneath fur that caught the otherworldly light. Her hindquarters were those of a hippopotamus, deceptively placid but capable of tremendous violence. Each component of Ammit's form was deliberately chosen. Hippos killed more humans along the Nile than any other creature, their massive jaws crushing boats and bones with equal ease. Lions stalked the desert margins, their roars echoing across the dunes, and Crocodilisa, the crocodiles were perhaps most feared of all. When the seasonal floods came, transforming the Nile into a rushing torrent of life-giving silt, the waters would catch and reflect the moonlight like scattered coins. In those silvery depths, crocodile eyes would gleam like distant lantern sparks, unblinking and patient. They were living reminders that the river, for all its gifts, could take as easily as it gave. If the heart outweighed the feather, Ammit would surge forward with horrifying grace. In one swift motion, she would devour the organ completely, condemning the soul to a second death-total annihilation. No afterlife, no rest, nothing but eternal void. It was the ultimate punishment in a culture that believed death was simply another form of existence. Tonight, as we drift along with the gentle current, listen to the papyrus rustling softly in the darkness, whispering stories of judgment and justice. The ancient Nile slides past, black as obsidian, carrying secrets from a time when gods walked among mortals, and the boundary between myth and reality was as thin as morning mist on the water. Deep in the humid forests of the Philippines, where ancient kapok trees stretch their gnarled fingers toward a canopy so thick it swallows sunlight, there lurks a creature that embodies mischief itself. The Tikbalang part horse, part man, entirely trouble. Picture, if you will, a being that stands 7 feet tall on impossibly spindly legs, its equine head crowned with a wild mane that seems to dance even when there's no breeze. Its arms hang long and ape-like, fingers ending in hooves that click against bamboo with an almost musical rhythm. The Tikbalang doesn't hunt for flesh or blood. No, its appetite is far more peculiar. It feeds on confusion, on the delicious panic of lost travelers. Village elders tell of how this gangly trickster will appear at crossroads, offering directions with a knowing grin that reveals teeth like worn river stones. Follow its guidance, and you'll find yourself walking in circles for hours, sometimes days, your compass spinning wildly as reality itself seems to fold like origami. But where did this legend truly originate? When Spanish conquistadors first arrived in the 16th century, their horses were utterly alien to the Tagalog people. These magnificent beasts, larger than any creature they'd known, seemed almost supernatural as they thundered across the landscape. Some historians suggest the Tikbalang emerged from these first encounters the indigenous mind, trying to process these foreign animals, blending them with familiar forest spirits, and perhaps memories of encounters with local primates, whose long arms and agile movement through the trees left lasting impressions. The bamboo adds its own voice to the Tikbalang's domain. When wind passes through these golden stalks, they knock together with hollow percussion-like sounds that can drive travelers to the edge of madness. Each grove becomes a natural orchestra of unease, where every creak and groan might herald the approach of hooves on forest floor. And so, as evening descends and the jungle breathes with 1,000 hidden lives, fireflies begin their ancient dance, tiny lanterns, tracing lazy spirals through the muggy air like scattered stars. In this realm between light and shadow, where Spanish history mingles with indigenous memory, the Tikbalang still roams, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to trust a grinning horseman at a lonely crossroads. In the warm Pacific waters surrounding the Solomon Islands, where coral gardens stretch beneath sapphire depths, ancient stories whisper of the Adaro half shark, half-human spirits who patrol the ocean's mysteries. These weren't mere folklore phantoms, but creatures born from the very real and terrifying encounters that shaped island life for countless generations. Picture, if you will, the Adaro emerging from deep-sea trenches at twilight. Their shark-like bodies slice through water with predatory grace, while their human torsos grip spears crafted from flying fish, those silvery missiles of the sea. Island fishermen knew these weapons well, for they'd witnessed flying fish burst from waves like living arrows, their needle-sharp fins catching moonlight as they soared. When such fish struck a canoe with unexpected force, it seemed less like chance and more like deliberate attack. The Adaro, villagers believed, were hurling these creatures as supernatural projectiles, defending their underwater realm from human intrusion. But perhaps the most unsettling encounters involved swordfish, those magnificent deep water hunters with their rapier bills. Imagine the shock of island paddlers when these massive fish would suddenly breach near their vessels, their sword-like noses piercing canoe hulls with surgical precision. To witness a swordfish leap from dark waters and strike with such apparent intent was to witness something beyond mere animal behavior. It felt personal, calculated, as if the ocean itself had taken offense. These weren't random attacks, but the work of Adaro warriors, commanding their swordfish mounts in battle against surface dwellers. The island's volcanic nature added another layer to these mysteries. Deep beneath the waves, underwater volcanic vents create columns of luminous water-natural light, shows that paint the depths in ethereal greens and blues. These phosphorescent displays, glimpsed from above during night fishing, created perfect conditions for mistaking shadow and light for something more sinister. A volcanic glow rising through dark water could easily become the radiant aura of an approaching Adaro spirit. As our tale drifts to a close like the gentle evening tide, imagine those same coral reefs where Adaro legends were born. Here, bioluminescent plankton create underwater galaxies with each movement, their tiny lights twinkling like scattered stars. The ocean breathes slowly, rhythmically, rocking these coral cities to sleep, while above, island children drift into dreams filled with shark spirits and flying fish. In this peaceful twilight realm, even the most fearsome sea legends feel comfortingly distant, like whispered lullabies carrying us toward gentle slumber. Long before Samuel de Champlain's musket cracked across the water in 1609, the Iroquois spoke of Tetoskok, a creature dwelling in the depths of the lake that would bear the explorer's name. Their stories painted something ancient and serpentine, something that moved through water like shadow through moonlight. When European settlers arrived, clutching their Bibles and their certainties, they'd soon discover that some indigenous wisdom runs deeper than any doctrine. By the 1870s, newspapers across Vermont and New York buzzed with lake monster fever. The Whitehall Times reported a water serpent, nearly 200 feet long, spotted by loggers who swore they'd never touched a drop of whiskey in their lives. Railroad workers claimed to see humps breaking the surface in perfect succession, like a living train cutting through liquid. Ship captains filed increasingly bizarre report screechers with horse-like heads, scaled necks thick as telegraph poles, eyes that glowed amber in the twilight. But Lake Champlain held quieter secrets. Long-nosed gar, ancient predators unchanged since the age of dinosaurs, would surface in coordinated chains during spawning season. Their prehistoric silhouettes, breaking water in rhythmic succession, created the perfect illusion of a single massive creature. Sturgeon, too, massive and mysterious, would breach in spectacular displays that sent sheets of water skyward. These giants, some over a century old, moved through the lake like living legends, because that's exactly what they'd become. Then there were the acoustic tricks the lake played on human ears. Boat wakes, rebounding off submerged ledges and underwater caves, created eerie respiratory rhythms that seemed to breathe through the water itself. Sound traveled strangely here, where thermal layers bent and twisted noise into whispers that might have been wind, or might have been something much larger, drawing breath just beneath the surface. In the end, perhaps Champlain's monster lives on because every lake needs its guardian spirit. Dawn mist still rises from these waters like ancient breath, and somewhere in the distance, a loon's call fades into silence that feels older than memory. The lake keeps its secrets well, whether they swim in flesh and scale, or simply in the spaces between what we see and what we allow ourselves to believe. When storm clouds gather over East Anglia's ancient heathland, locals still whisper of scratches carved deep into church door claw marks too large for any earthly hound. These gouges, worn smooth by centuries of nervous fingers tracing their edges, tell of Black Shuck, the demon dog whose glowing eyes once terrorized the countryside. Picture those medieval nights when thunder rolled across the Norfolk Broads and lightning split the darkness. Farmers huddled in their cottages, listening to something massive padding through their fields' footsteps too heavy, breathing too deep, eyes burning like red coals in the tempest. Come morning, they'd find those telltale scratches on the church doors, as if something had tried desperately to claw its way into sacred ground. The most famous encounter happened at Blytheburgh Church in 1577, when Black Shuck supposedly burst through the nave during Sunday service, killing 2 parishioners and leaving scorch marks that visitors can still see today. But here's where legend meets reality in the most delightful way. Those demon dog sightings? They likely had 4 very real paws. Consider the escaped Great Danes from wealthy estates, or the massive wolfhounds brought by Viking raiders who settled these very marshlands. A 200-pound dog, soaked by rain and illuminated by lightning, would certainly look otherworldly to a terrified farmer. These weren't mythical beasts, they were very large, very real dogs, having the worst night of their lives, probably just as frightened as the humans who spotted them. The coastal geography played its part too. When fierce storms rolled in from the North Sea, lightning would strobe across the flat landscape, casting enormous shadows of perfectly ordinary dogs onto church walls and cottage sides. A medium-sized sheepdog, backlit by a lightning flash, could appear monstrous against ancient stone. Tonight, rest beside one of those old flint churches dotting the Norfolk countryside, its nave lit only by silver moonbeams streaming through medieval windows. Listen to the wind sighing through the churchyard yews, and perhaps you'll understand how a lost dog became a legend. The scratches on the door remain, but they tell a gentler story of frightened animals seeking shelter, just like the humans who feared them. Sometimes the most terrifying monsters are simply creatures caught in the storm, looking for somewhere safe to wait until morning comes. Deep in the heart of Germanic folklore, miners would whisper stories around flickering candlelight about the fearsome fire drakes that dwelled in mountain caverns. These weren't the winged dragons of night's tales, but serpentine beasts of living flame that could melt rock with their breath, and whose very presence turned stone to molten rivers. The old songs spoke of warriors who ventured too deep into the earth's belly, only to encounter these creatures of pure fire emerging from cracks in the cavern walls, their eyes like burning coals and their breath a torrent of liquid death. But what the ancients called dragon fire was likely something far more fascinating than fantasy. In volcanic regions across northern Europe, particularly where coal seams run close to the surface, natural phenomena create exactly the kind of terrifying displays these legends describe. Basalt vents, formed by ancient lava flows, create natural chimneys through which methane gas escapes from underground coal deposits. When this methane encounters the right conditions, perhaps a lightning strike or the spark from a miner's torch, it ignites in spectacular fashion, creating roaring columns of flame that can persist for hours or even days. The effect is genuinely terrifying to witness. The flames shoot upward through rocky fissures, with a sound like an enormous bellows, accompanied by a deep rumbling that seems to emanate from the very bones of the earth. The heat is so intense it can be felt from hundreds of yards away, and the light illuminates the surrounding landscape with an otherworldly orange glow. Small wonder that our ancestors, lacking our modern understanding of geology and chemistry, would interpret these natural blast furnaces as the breath of some massive, subterranean beast. Icelandic chronicles from the medieval period describe exactly such phenomena during volcanic eruptions. One account from a monk near Hekla tells of great serpents of fire emerging from mountain crevices, burning everything in their path. Another describes flames that danced like living things and made sounds as if all the devils of hell were roaring at once. These weren't metaphors or religious hysteria, they were accurate descriptions of methane vents igniting during seismic activity. And so, as we drift towards sleep, imagine those ancient flames still flickering in forgotten caverns, their roar now softened to something like a gentle giant's snore echoing through stone corridors, a reminder that our Earth still breathes fire in its deepest dreams. Deep in the dense rainforests of Central Africa, where ancient rivers carve mysterious paths through emerald shadows, the Baka people have long whispered of something that shouldn't exist. They call it Mokelembembe, the one who stops rivers. For generations, their elders have gathered children around flickering fires to share stories of this creature living echo from when the world was young. The Baka describe encounters that chill the spine. Fishermen paddling their dugout canoes along the Sanga River speak of a massive form rising from murky water's serpentine neck crowned with a small head, eyes like ancient amber watching from the depths. Some say it's as long as 10 men laid end to end, with skin like wet leather and a temperament as unpredictable as the river itself. When Mokelembembe decides to surface, canoes become toys, tossed aside like leaves in a storm. But perhaps the truth is more mundane, yet no less wondrous. African forest elephants, those magnificent grey giants, are surprisingly aquatic. When crossing deep rivers, they'll submerge completely, using their trunks as snorkels, creating an illusion that could easily fool witnesses at dawn or dusk. A trunk held high above dark water, the massive bulk obscured below, might appear exactly like the long neck of some prehistoric survivor. The legend gained new life in the 1980s, when misidentified sauropod fossils were discovered in Cameroon. Suddenly, cryptozoologists had evidence that dinosaurs might still roam the Congo basin. Expeditions poured in, armed with cameras and grand ambitions, though none returned with proof more compelling than blurry photographs and second-hand testimonies. Tonight, somewhere along a forgotten oxbow lake deep in the Congolese wilderness, mist rises like ghostly fingers from still black water. Ancient trees lean inward, their canopies weaving shadows darker than dreams. Insects drone their eternal chorus, while something, perhaps an elephant seeking cooler water, perhaps something else entirely, sends gentle ripples across the surface. The Ba'aka elders smile knowingly, understanding that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, cherished in the space between what we know and what we wonder. Deep in the Amazon's green cathedral, where ancient trees tower like pillars holding up a ceiling of leaves, the Guarani people tell of a guardian that walks backward through time itself. The Mapinguari shuffles through their stories with feet turned heel to toe, leaving tracks that point toward yesterday while the beast lumbers toward tomorrow. Picture, if you will, a creature the size of a small elephant, draped in coarse reddish hair that hangs like Spanish moss from its powerful frame. Its single eye glows with the intensity of a firefly trapped in amber, while its mouth yawns open to reveal rows of teeth designed not for flesh, but for grinding. Most unsettling of all is the stench that announces its presence, a musk so potent it can drop a grown man at 50 paces, leaving him gasping for clean air that simply doesn't exist in the Mapinguari's shadow. Now, before you dismiss this as mere folklore, consider that paleontologists have unearthed the fossilized remains of giant ground sloths throughout South America. These magnificent beasts, some standing 12 feet tall, possessed powerful claws and defensive capabilities that would make any modern predator think twice. The Mapinguari's legendary odor finds its echo in the scent glands of contemporary anteaters. whose defensive emissions can clear a forest clearing faster than a chainsaw. During the rubber boom of the late 19th century, when fortune seekers carved deeper into the Amazon than ever before, Mapinguari sightings multiplied like tributaries feeding a great river. Terrified tappers told of encounters with the beast, each tale growing in the telling until the creature became less forest guardian and more forest demon. These stories served a purpose beyond entertainment. They kept outsiders away from sacred groves and hunting grounds that had sustained indigenous communities for countless generations. Tonight, as rain drums against the canopy above and mist rises from the forest floor, somewhere in that vast green expanse, moss muffles every footstep. Every fallen branch, every rustle of leaves, might herald the approach of something ancient, something that walks backward through our understanding of the world. Sweet dreams, wherever you may be. In the crystal waters off the Bahamas, where tourists now snap selfies above sapphire depths, local divers once whispered of something that defied every marine biology textbook. They called it the Luscar creature that was half shark, half octopus, lurking in the blue holes that puncture the ocean floor like forgotten wounds. Picture this nightmare: the sleek, predatory body of a shark, but where fins should be, writhing tentacles thick as ship ropes, each one lined with suckers that could strip flesh from bone. The stories were remarkably consistent. Divers would descend into the cathedral-like spaces of these underwater caves, their lights cutting through water so clear it felt like flying through liquid glass. Then, from the indigo darkness below, something would emerge that their minds struggled to process. Not quite shark, not quite octopus, but a fusion that seemed designed by evolution's fever dreams. But here's where the ancient tales meet modern underwater cameras. Marine biologists have documented something extraordinary: reef octopuses actively hunting reef sharks. Yes, you heard that correctly. These 8-armed architects of camouflage have been filmed wrapping their tentacles around small sharks, subduing them with a patience that borders on the philosophical. The octopus doesn't rush its kill. It simply waits. Its tentacles pulse gently, almost affectionately, as the shark's struggles slowly fade. The blue holes themselves hold another piece of this puzzle. These geological timepieces, carved by ancient waters, create their own mysterious physics. As tides shift above, the caves below become hydraulic engines, generating powerful suctions that can pull even experienced divers deeper than they intended to go. Imagine being caught in that invisible current, dragged down toward darkness, and seeing something impossible writhing in the depths below. Today, we drift through these sapphire silences, with our understanding intact, watching lone tentacles curl around coral formations, like living calligraphy written in flesh. The Lusca may have been myth, but the blue holes remember everything, every story, every fear, every half-glimpsed shadow that made ancient hearts race. In these depths, where sunlight arrives as scattered coins of gold, the line between legend and reality dissolves like salt in water, leaving only the eternal dance of predator and prey playing out in slow motion beneath our floating world. In the misty waters surrounding the Orkney Islands, where the North Sea crashes against ancient cliffs with the persistence of a lovesick poet, there lived creatures that blurred the line between myth and mammal. The Selkies, those enigmatic seal folk, would emerge from the depths on moonlit nights, their sleek forms glistening as they hauled themselves onto secluded beaches. Picture this: a curious fisherman, returning late from checking his nets, glimpses movement on the shore ahead. As his eyes adjust to the silver darkness, he witnesses something extraordinary. The seals begin to shed their skins like discarded cloaks, revealing beneath them the most beautiful humans he has ever seen. Women with hair like spun moonbeams dance barefoot on the sand, their laughter carried on the salt-tinged wind. But here's where nature provides its own special effects. The waters around these dancing figures shimmer and sparkle with an otherworldly light. Bioluminescent plankton, disturbed by the seals' earlier passage through the waves, cling to their wet skin and hair, creating an ethereal glow that pulses with each movement. To our awestruck fishermen, these aren't just women dancing, they're goddesses wreathed in starlight, beings too magical for this mundane world. The Selkie tales often turn dark, however, when human desire overwhelms wonder, a man spies a selkie's skin, left carelessly on the rocks while she dances, and steals it. Without her seal skin, she cannot return to the sea. She must marry him, bear his children, live a landlocked life of quiet desperation. This motif echoes something more sinister from Orkney's past, the Norse raids that swept down from Scandinavia, carrying away women and children to lives of bondage far from home. Yet in the gentler tellings, love blooms naturally between human and selkie. Years may pass in contentment until the call of the sea grows too strong. One day, the man returns home to find the hidden skin discovered, his wife gone, only wet footprints leading to the water's edge. As our fisherman watches the dancers fade back into their seal forms and slip beneath the waves, the shore returns to stillness. The tide rolls in with its eternal rhythm, swaddling silver shapes at rest among the rocks, where the line between seal and human remains beautifully, mysteriously blurred. In the misty highlands of Flores, where ancient volcanic peaks pierce morning clouds, the villagers still whisper of the Ebu Gogo. These weren't your garden variety fairy tale dwarfs spinning gold or cobbling shoes. No, the Ebu Gogo were notorious rice thieves with an appetite that could bankrupt entire villages. Local stories paint them as hairy, child-sized creatures who'd descend from the limestone caves like a plague of very small locusts. They'd ransack granaries with the efficiency of a tax collector, stuffing their cheeks with stolen rice while chattering in their peculiar, almost human language. The villagers tried everything: guard dogs, warning bells, even leaving out sacrificial offerings of rice wine. Nothing worked. The Ebu Gogo were apparently both incorrigible thieves and teetotalers. Then came 2004, when archaeologists digging in Liangbua Cave unearthed something extraordinary. Tiny human skulls, delicate bones, an entire population of diminutive people who'd lived on Flores until perhaps 500 years ago. Scientists dubbed them Homo floresiensis, though hobbits rolled off the tongue rather better at dinner parties. These weren't mythical creatures at all, but real humans adults standing barely 3 feet tall, with brains the size of grapefruits yet sophisticated enough to craft tools and hunt dwarf elephant. Suddenly, grandmother's stories about the rice-stealing little people seemed less like folklore and more like cultural memory passed down through generations. The legends spoke of the Ebu Gogo's uncanny ability to repeat human speech, mimicking words without understanding, much like parrots. Researchers noted this detail with particular interest, as Flores hosts several species of gifted mimicking birds. Perhaps ancient storytellers, hearing these creatures chatter in the forest darkness, attributed similar vocal talents to their mysterious neighbors. The jungle holds its secrets close. Modern Florians still claim to hear strange calls echoing from the deeper caves, though whether from birds or something else entirely, who can say? As evening settles over the island and the first cicadas begin their slow, hypnotic drone, one wonders what other myths might be sleeping in the archaeological record, waiting for the right moment to step from legend into startling reality. In the flickering lamplight of colonial Kenya, settlers whispered of something that shouldn't exist. They called it the Nandi bear, though it bore little resemblance to any bear known to science. This phantom stalked the highlands where the Nandi people had spoken its name for generations, a creature that seemed assembled from nightmares and half-remembered glimpses. The reports painted a consistent picture of impossibility. Larger than a hyena but built like a bear, with a sloping back that gave it an almost human gait when it reared up. Its coat was described as dark and shaggy, sometimes reddish-brown, sometimes black as the spaces between stars, but most unsettling were the accounts of its behavior. Unlike the scavenging hyenas, this beast was said to be boldly predatory, raiding livestock with calculated intelligence and disappearing into the darkness before pursuers could organize. British administrators documented these encounters with the methodical precision of people trying to make sense of the senseless. Cattle found torn apart in ways that didn't match known predators. Tracks too large for hyenas, too broad for leopards. Witnesses describing eyes that glowed with an inner fire and a laugh that chilled the blood in ways even hyena calls couldn't manage. Modern science offers elegant explanations for these colonial ghost stories. East Africa was once home to short-faced hyenas, massive predators that dwarfed their modern cousins. These extinct giants, possess the size and power to match the Nandi bear descriptions perfectly. When you factor in the honey badger, scaled up by fear and poor lighting, the mysterious beast begins to make sense. Honey badgers, despite their small size, display exactly the kind of fearless aggression attributed to the Nandi bear. But perhaps the most revealing clue lies in the eyeshine. Colonial settlers carried lanterns and torches that would have made any nocturnal animal's eyes blaze like twin suns. The flickering light, the adrenaline of a dangerous encounter, the natural human tendency to embellish a good story all conspired to transform ordinary animals into legendary monsters. Tonight, if you find yourself walking beneath African stars, listen to the savanna grasses whispering in the wind. They remember when shadows moved differently, when the line between the known and unknown ran thinner than moonlight. The Nandi bear may have been nothing more than misidentified wildlife, but in a land where legend and reality dance together under endless skies, perhaps that distinction matters less than we think. In the red heart of Australia's Arnhem Land, where ancient escarpments rise like sleeping giants from the floodplains, Aboriginal peoples have told stories of Ngaliod for 60,000 years. The rainbow snake, they whisper, is no mere legend but a living force that binds water, earth, and sky into one shimmering dance of creation. Picture this magnificent being as it moves through the dreamtime, its scales shifting through every color known to human eyes. Ngaliod stretches across the heavens like a cosmic bridge, painting storms with broad strokes of lightning and thunder. When the serpent arches its back, rain cascades from its belly, flooding the drought-stricken land below. Where it touches earth, billabongs spring forth like jewels scattered across the landscape, and the first rivers carve their winding paths toward the sea. But here's where ancient wisdom meets modern observation. Every wet season, massive olive pythons emerge from their dry season refuges, their golden-brown bodies gleaming like liquid bronze in the stormlight. These real serpents, some stretching 20 feet long, move through the rising waters with the same fluid grace their mythical cousin possesses. As they hunt fish trapped in seasonal pools, double rainbows arch overhead, their prismatic bands seeming to echo the python's undulating movements below. The connection runs deeper than coincidence. On rock galleries throughout Arnhem Land, ochre paintings thousands of years old depict serpentine forms that blur the line between rainbow and snake, between meteorology and biology. Indigenous artists capture both the celestial arc and the earthbound python in single brushstrokes, their art recognizing what science now confirms, that these phenomena share the same seasonal rhythm, the same life-giving relationship with water. As our story draws to a close, imagine standing beneath one of these painted overhangs as an afternoon thunderstorm approaches. The first rumbles roll across the escarpment like distant drums, growing closer with each heartbeat. Lightning illuminates the ancient artwork, and for just a moment, the painted serpents seem to writhe in the flickering light. The thunder softens, becoming indistinguishable from the rhythmic beating that has accompanied Dreamtime stories for millennia, drums that carry the rainbow snake song into another generation of dreams. In the rolling hills of KwaZulu-Natal, where acacia trees cast long shadows and the evening air carries whispers of ancient wisdom, the Zulu people speak in hushed tones of a creature that bridges the gap between mischief and terror. Meet the Tikalosia dwarf-like spirit no taller than a child's waist, covered in coarse hair, with glowing red eyes that pierce the darkness like twin embers. This nocturnal trickster doesn't simply haunt, it personalizes its torment with an artist's attention to detail. The Tikalosia's preferred method of harassment is delightfully specific. It perches on sleeping chests like a grotesque gargoyle, its weight pressing down with supernatural heaviness. Victims wake paralyzed, unable to scream or move, while the creature whispers unspeakable things or simply stares with those burning eyes. Some report feeling tiny hands exploring their faces, or hearing the creature's raspy breathing inches from their ears. Children are particular favorites, though the Tikaloshi seems to enjoy terrorizing adults who've somehow earned its attention, usually through the machinations of a grudge-holding neighbor who's hired a sangoma to send it their way. Modern science offers a fascinating lens through which to view these encounters. Sleep paralysis affects millions worldwide, creating the perfect psychological conditions for Tikaloshi visitations. The inability to move, the crushing chest sensation, the hypnagogic hallucinations. But here's where it gets interesting. The creature's description bears remarkable similarities to the Cape clawless otter, a playful river dweller, known for its mischievous behavior and human-like hands. Could centuries of otter encounters, filtered through cultural memory and sleep-deprived minds, have birthed this enduring legend? The Zulu response to Tikaloshe troubles is beautifully practical. Families raise their beds on stacks of bricks, creating a fortress of height that the earthbound spirit supposedly cannot breach. Some hang mirrors to confuse it, while others leave saucers of milk as tribute. These rituals persist today, passed down through generations who understand that some protections transcend rational explanation. Picture now a traditional reed hut in the quiet hours before dawn. The family sleeps peacefully on their elevated bed while below, the packed earth floor remains undisturbed. In the hearth, the final ember of the night's fire glows like a benevolent red, eye harmless, warm, and protective. Outside, the African night continues its ancient symphony, while somewhere in the darkness, perhaps, a small creature with knowing eyes watches and waits. In the rolling hills of KwaZulu-Natal, where acacia trees cast long shadows and the evening air carries whispers of ancient wisdom, the Zulu people speak in hushed tones of a creature that bridges the gap between mischief and terror. Meet the Tikalosia dwarf-like spirit no taller than a child's waist, covered in coarse hair, with glowing red eyes that pierce the darkness like twin embers. This nocturnal trickster doesn't simply haunt, it personalizes its torment with an artist's attention to detail. The Tikalosha's preferred method of harassment is delightfully specific. It perches on sleeping chests like a grotesque gargoyle, its weight pressing down with supernatural heaviness. Victims wake paralyzed, unable to scream or move, while the creature whispers unspeakable things or simply stares with those burning eyes. Some report feeling tiny hands exploring their faces, or hearing the creature's raspy breathing inches from their ears. Children are particular favorites, though the Tikaloshi seems to enjoy terrorizing adults who've somehow earned its attention, usually through the machinations of a grudge-holding neighbor who's hired a sangoma to send it their way. Modern science offers a fascinating lens through which to view these encounters. Sleep paralysis affects millions worldwide, creating the perfect psychological conditions for Tikaloshi visitations. The inability to move, the crushing chest sensation, the hypnagogic hallucinations. But here's where it gets interesting. The creature's description bears remarkable similarities to the Cape clawless otter, a playful river dweller, known for its mischievous behavior and human-like hands. Could centuries of otter encounters, filtered through cultural memory and sleep-deprived minds, have birthed this enduring legend? The Zulu response to Tikaloshe troubles is beautifully practical. Families raise their beds on stacks of bricks, creating a fortress of height that the earthbound spirit supposedly cannot breach. Some hang mirrors to confuse it, while others leave saucers of milk as tribute. These rituals persist today, passed down through generations who understand that some protections transcend rational explanation. Picture now a traditional reed hut in the quiet hours before dawn. The family sleeps peacefully on their elevated bed while below, the packed earth floor remains undisturbed. In the hearth, the final ember of the night's fire glows like a benevolent red, eye harmless, warm, and protective. Outside, the African night continues its ancient symphony, while somewhere in the darkness, perhaps, a small creature with knowing eyes watches and waits. In the vast emptiness of the Gobi Desert, where the horizon bleeds into infinity and silence has weight, there lurks a creature that has haunted the dreams of nomads for centuries. They call it Olgoi Korkoithi intestine worma crimson horror that emerges from the sand to bring death with a glance. The herders speak in whispers around their fires, their voices barely disturbing the desert air. They tell of a creature thick as a man's arm, red as fresh blood, with no discernible head or tail. This silent death moves beneath the surface, sensing vibrations through the earth. When disturbed, it rears up like an angry serpent, spitting corrosive yellow acid that can kill a camel at 30 paces. The old ones warn never to touch anything metal after rain, for the worm can send death through steel itself. But perhaps the nomads saw something real in those shifting sands. Far from the Gobi, in the rain-soaked soils of Washington's Palouse Prairie, giant earthworms stretch to impossible lengths, 3 meters of segmented flesh that can live for decades. The Gippsland earthworm of Australia grows even larger, its muscle contractions audible as it moves through the earth like a biological train. These gentle giants process tons of soil in their lifetimes, architects of the very ground we walk upon. The acid-spitting and electric death that terrifies the desert dwellers likely arose from the peculiar properties of the Gobi itself. In that arid landscape, static electricity builds like a sleeping storm. Metal objects become conduits for painful shocks, and the dry air itself can crackle with unseen energy. What nomad, receiving a sudden jolt from his bridle or water bucket, wouldn't believe in the worm's electrical vengeance? Tonight, somewhere in the Gobi's heart, sand continues its eternal dance across empty dunes. Above, stars pierce the darkness like ancient eyes, watching over a landscape where myth and reality intertwine like lovers in the dark. The earth keeps its secrets well,